Hey guys, howdy. I hope you're fine. As you've seen in the thumbnail, in this video, we're going to see that what if Naruto mastered Fuuinjutsu like ancient runes? Part 2, I request you to check the author of this fanfic and show some love and support. Name of the story is Effloresco Secundus by Romanescu. Do check it out. All details in description. And if you want next part of this series, please leave a like and comment 5 blue emoji. Let's get into the video. Also, check out Patreon for I have Upload Naruto X Daenerys Targaryen in censored spicy version. Link in description. Sakura placed her hands half a decimeter above the spilled tea, forming 3 seals in quick succession. Her hands glowed with a stronger bluish light than Sakura had anticipated as she carefully created a bubble around the pool of liquid. In this manner, she methodically quarantined every single drop of tea she or Pakin found, pouring enough chakra into the quarantining bubbles for them to stay in position for several hours without her having to manually maintain them. Then she went to pull the curtains shut. Filtered through the thick cloth, the light in the room grew duskier and yellower, drawing the no-go seal, formerly the seal of separation. On the floor, she created a thin net of chakra around the house that every shinobi passing by would recognize as the mark of an ongoing investigation that required no further interference at this point. It was one of the few seals they'd been taught in the academy, but one she hadn't expected to use for quite some time yet. Naruto had been so quiet that when he spoke up, she nearly threw a kunai his way. He was perched on a chair, looking smaller than he usually did, but a bit less pale. "What was that?" he asked, voice uncharacteristically quiet, but lacking the previous stutter. Absently, she explained the principles behind the seal, her mind still caught up in trying to figure out the poison. "Naruto, when your clone dispelled, you said there was a strange smell," Sakura said slowly, wondering why she hadn't picked up on that before now. She didn't notice any outstanding smells at all, but Naruto had said the smell cloaked the bodies. "Yeah," Naruto grimaced. "It does smell sort of oily, but underneath that dash," he sniffed the air and then his nose crinkled. "There's some another smell. It's biting, like that stuff in jars with pickles. White vinegar." Sakura guessed, intrigued. She tried sniffing the air as well, but still couldn't catch any hint of a scent that matched either Pakin's or Naruto's description. "The boy's right," the pug said. "Don't know much about human foods, but Kakashi likes pickled daikon. It does smell sort of like that, the venom." Pakin turned towards Naruto, scratching absently at his ear. "Boy, you have a good nose. Could give an Inuzuka some competition on that end." Looking confused, Naruto thanked the Nin dog, and Sakura had to wonder if her teammate hadn't actually realized how good his nose was before this. She'd have expected him to brag in that brash, loud sort of way he sometimes did, but he just seemed surprised. "Girl, maybe you should bag a sample." Pakin was still turned towards Naruto, but that comment was obviously for her. "I don't have any sample bags with me." Sakura muttered absently, annoyed with herself. Naruto looked up at that, then reached with one hand into his kunai pouch and withdrew a small transparent container and a plastic pipette. Sakura immediately recognized them from the academy lectures on poison. "Well prepared," she said, nodding as she accepted them, and tried not to look surprised that Naruto had remembered to pack these. Naruto shrugged, seeming faintly embarrassed. "I packed them ages ago and forgot about them." Sakura would have thrown him an amused glance, if not for the dead body, lying only a few feet away. Instead, she focused on taking a sample of the spilled liquid and then tucked it into her own pouch. A moment later, Naruto tensed, and recognizing the signs now that she'd seen him receive his clone's memory once before, Sakura braced herself. But Naruto looked relieved. "The kid's room is empty," he began, and Sakura assumed he meant the room Abe's grandson had been staying in. "So are the guest rooms. No weird smells or anything." "That's good," Sakura said, and carefully didn't add that perhaps the rooms were empty when they shouldn't have been. If she suggested kidnapping at this point, she'd only spook Naruto for no reason. Pakin met her eyes for a moment, and Sakura got the feeling the pug was thinking along the same lines. Kakashi showed up a few minutes later with Sasuke in tow, looking grim, but not like he'd been fighting. That was a relief, at least. The Jounin's gray, I swept over the scene, nodded approvingly at the bubbles that contained the poison and at the seal of separation. No sign of any intrusions or of fighting, Sasuke said after a glance at the Jounin. Kakashi had Sakura and Naruto report their own finds. I half-lit it in apparent thought. Did you notice if the window to the child's bedroom was open? Kakashi said from where he'd wandered over to stare at one of the contained pools of tainted tea. Naruto's brows drew together in confusion before he went on to deny it. The Jounin hummed. He looked a lot more relaxed than he'd been before he and Sasuke left. But she didn't fail to notice the fact that Kakashi's clones hadn't returned with him. Naruto fidgeted in the following silence. What now? We report to the Hokage's tower, Sakura said automatically, remembering the academy lessons on the proper post-mission procedures. Though the procedures mentioned in the academy only applied to Genin-level missions, and there was no doubt that whatever had happened here was way above Genin level. Kakashi turned around, hands in his pockets. Sakura is right. He made a shooing motion towards the door, and both Sasuke and Naruto were very quick about following that particular suggestion. If Sakura had moved out as fast as the boys, she would have missed the masked person who between 1 second and another was suddenly crouched in the window. A ringlet of violet hair curled over the person's shoulder, but that was all Sakura registered before Kakashi guided her out the door. Sakura kept her mouth shut when they joined Sasuke and Naruto again. An ANBU? Kakashi must have called him or her here. But why an ANBU? Why not another Jounin or a Chunin? Even, ANBU only attended to the most difficult or secretive missions, at least as she'd understood it. Sakura's thoughts occupied her the whole way to the Hokage's tower, which was just as well, since her teammates didn't seem to be in any mood to talk either. Maybe Kakashi signaled them in some subtle way, or maybe the Jounin gathered in the tower were feeling particularly generous, but they allowed Sakura's team to head into the Hokage's office despite having arrived there before them. Sakura heard the girl on Shikamaru's team, Ino, make loud complaints to who she assumed was their Jounin sensei before the door closed behind her and shut out the noise. They walked through the chamber where the lower-ranked missions were received and reported in, and then moved on to the door to the Hokage's office. Sakura noticed Irika sensei seated behind one of the desks. Funny, she hadn't known Irika worked in the mission room. Requesting a private briefing, Kakashi said the second they stepped inside the spacious room, his voice lazy. Their aging leader looked at him for a moment, taking a long draw of his pipe and nodded to the secretary at his side. She stumbled up ungracefully, tall heels making her walk fragile and slow. Civilians, Sasuke muttered under his breath, and Sakura threw him a sharp glance. She knew some shinobi held less than favorable views of civilians, but she hadn't expected that from Sasuke. She'd never heard him make any disparaging remarks towards civilians in the past. But then again, he had once been part of a clan. Clan shinobi were more likely to hold some level of contempt for civilians, in her experience. She was tempted to say something, but settled for keeping her eyes on him until he looked up and, noticing her expression, grimaced. Sakura could have pointed out that the secretary's purple hair was quite reminiscent of a certain ANBU she'd seen not 5 minutes ago, but she had a feeling that would have ruined the point she'd been trying to make. Sakura wasn't overly surprised when they were all called to report, though she wasn't sure if it was to ensure a comprehensive picture of their findings or if the Hokage was testing them. He had to know they'd already reported to Kakashi before coming here. Naruto explained what his clones had found, and then Sakura rehashed her and Pakin's discussion, as well as her use of the no-go seal and the quarantining of the tea. Sasuke went ahead and explained his and Kakashi's lack of perimeter finds that were even remotely suspicious. Though, as they were all aware, absence of proof wasn't proof of absence. Someone skilled at not leaving tracks could have left through the perimeter limit Kakashi and Sasuke had scouted. Kakashi added a few words to Sasuke's report, but other than that he stood quiet. Sakura found herself doing a double take when from the corner of her, as she spotted her teacher with his nose in that damn book. In front of the Hokage, for your D rank to turn into something like this. Konoha's old leader said with a sigh, leaving the sentence unfinished. Sir, had Abe-san received any threats prior to this? Sakura asked when he didn't say anything further. She made sure to keep her voice quietly respectful and to stand straight-backed. As Sakura, she was unaccustomed to feeling the thrum of war zing through her veins. The adrenaline wouldn't drain from her body and in her mind. Flashes of blood and fire and green light danced, drawing her tight posture even tighter until her shoulders felt strained. The Hokage looked at her for a long moment. "I'm afraid I was not acquainted with Abe-san or Ino-kun." Sakura blinked and nodded, feeling oddly high-strung and like something in her chest was vibrating. Of course he didn't know Abe. Why would he? She hadn't really expected the Hokage to know every person in the village. So why would she assume that he knew their client? Naruto started saying something about how maybe Abe was secretly a spy or secretly a Yakuza with a rival, sounding jittery nervous rather than cheerful. And she took a step back. These were battle nerves, she thought as she observed the slight tremble in her fingers. Being jarred out of complacency would do that to you, she thought with a hard mental smile. She'd spent years feeling mostly safe in this village. This village of ninja. What a stupid mistake to make. You will receive a payment equivalent to that of a completed C ranks, the Hokage was saying when Sakura's attention wandered back out of her own head. This mission is to be regarded as classified. You will not speak of it with anyone outside your team. Sakura and the boys nodded immediately. She doubted any of them felt like talking about this, and even if they did, who would they talk to? The closest she herself had to a friend besides her team was Shikamaru, who was really just an acquaintance, and, as far as she knew, Naruto and Sasuke had even less than that. "You may take your leave." As politely as the Hokage had phrased that, they all knew it for the dismissal it was. Sakura immediately headed for the door, the boys not far behind her. That was, Naruto sounded shocked still, and Sakura turned to look at him from the corner of her eye. If this was the first time he'd seen death, perhaps he shouldn't be left alone right now. But she herself wasn't really in the mood for company, not with the jingle-jangle of her war memories ringing like bells in her head. Sasuke's back was ramrod straight as he stomped ahead of them, and Sakura's thought turned briefly towards the death of his clan. Damn it, he shouldn't be left alone either. And why was that even on her shoulders? Shouldn't Kakashi? As though her thoughts had summoned him, Kakashi suddenly appeared by her side, and only then did Sakura realize they'd walked off without him. She was more rattled than she'd realized, obviously. "Children," Kakashi said and clapped his hands. "Your day isn't over yet. Did you suddenly forget you need a dismissal from your teacher before you can take your leave?" The air about him was less than serious, but he wasn't as chirpy and annoying as usual. Sakura doubted he was as affected as they were, or even affected at all, but perhaps he was for once being mindful of their collective mood. He casually herded them out of the tower and continued leading them through the Maple District's alleys. They walked in silence, and for once Sakura wished that the boys would start bickering. All she could hear was their steps against stone and the whoosh of her heart in her ears. "And here we are," Kakashi spoke up suddenly, facing a large green door with heavy scorch marks making black gouges in the wood. Voices could faintly be heard through the door, a murmur of conversation. "What is this?" Sasuke said in a mutter, looking narrow-eyed at the door. Probably just his reasonable suspicion of everything Kakashi said or did shining through, Sakura thought. Naruto was looking up at the door with a tilt to his head and then said slowly, "Sensei, it smells like beer. Or maybe sake." He could smell that from the other side of the door. Sakura spared him a surprised glance, relieved to find that the conversation was lessening the jumpiness in her limbs. "Bars usually do," Kakashi said, leaning nonchalantly on the door until it opened. Sakura's eyebrows rose, Naruto gaped, and Sasuke's expression grew sour as he crossed his arms. Now, don't be like that, children." He swept them in through the door before they could protest, and the three of them almost tripped down the short stairs on the other side. The smell of alcohol was like invisible smog in the air. "Kakashi-kun," said the woman behind the bar desk, pausing in her cleaning of a large glass to smile at him. The empty eye sockets that gaped up at them would have taken Sakura aback more if she hadn't been so busy adjusting to the change in atmosphere. The air was warm and comfortable, with people playing cards and go at different tables. She'd underestimated Kakashi, because when he'd mentioned that this was a bar, she'd assumed it would be something not out of place in Nocturne Alley. But this was different. Momo-san, it's been a while. Kakashi sauntered up to the woman and gave her a quick kiss. It didn't look romantic in the slightest to Sakura, but Sasuke grunted and Naruto made some vaguely shocked sound. I brought some brats for you to meet. Sasuke was the first to head towards the woman, though his steps were rigid and his expression uncomfortable. Naruto and Sakura followed a second later. First time here, the woman, Momo, asked gently when they were all standing in front of her. She reminded Sakura of a ministry interrogator called Asmus something, if Sakura recalled correctly. That woman had been without eyes too, and had that same air of focus that made you feel like she could see you anyway, though Asma's cheeks hadn't been adorned with faded red triangles. Yes, ma'am, said Naruto hesitantly. He was staring at her face with horrified fascination. Sasuke avoided looking at her face directly at all, though whether from discomfort or politeness, Sakura couldn't say. Though Sasuke usually wasn't much for politeness. First-timers, hey, a man a few tables over called out. And when they turned to look at him, he and most of the other patrons raised their glasses or mugs or sake cups, as if in salute. It felt strangely formal, maybe because their gazes lingered even after downing the alcohol. I don't suppose it's anything you can tell an old retired nin like myself, Momo said, but have the first round on me, bratlings. I imagine you need it. The large shaggy dog at her feet that Sakura somehow hadn't even noticed let out a grunt, like it agreed. She squinted at it, realizing that the dog was missing one of its ears. A deep scar slashed through the short fur on its muzzle. First time's always the roughest, said another patron seated on a bar stool and leaning heavily on the bar disc. He took a sip of his mug as they watched. Sakura was starting to realize that the first time being referred to had nothing to do with first times in a bar. It's not my first time, Sasuke muttered, crossing his arms even tighter over his chest. First time during a mission, Sasuke-kun, said Kakashi quietly. He patted him briefly on the shoulder and ignored the subsequent glare directed his way. What? Naruto frowned at them all, absently twisting the edge of his shirt in his hands as he looked about the room. First time here means first time mission death. The man leaning on the bar desk slurred, and Momo shot him a small frown even as she turned towards Naruto, who'd paled a little again and nodded. It's become something of a tradition, though of course, not everyone follows it. Momo smiled again, bittersweet as her sightless gaze passed over them. Yeah, those snobby Hyugas would never set their dainty, high-class feet in here. The patron who'd shouted at them before shouted again. Quiet chuckles spread throughout the room. Now, what can I get you? She asked, putting her hands flat to the wood. Before Sakura could declare that she wasn't going to let her young, not yet teenage body consume any quantities of alcohol, Kakashi leaned forward. A small cup of warmed Juimaishu light for each of them. Kakashi, you cheap bastard. Juimaishu light? That barely has any sting in it. A woman with short purple hair dressed in fishnet said loudly around a mouthful of what looked to be dango. Kakashi threw her a crinkled-eyed smile, but made no comment. If Sakura remembered correctly, no distilled alcohol was added to high-grade sake, so the light version might be acceptable, after all. A small cup wouldn't do any harm. Okay, she said quietly, and met Sasuke's surprised look with a wan half-smile. Naruto was already nodding, apparently more at ease with the idea than she. Momo poured them a tiny cup each of the warm liquid and placed them in front of 3 seats. Kakashi was already lounging against the bar with a slightly larger cup. The atmosphere was still warm, friendly. Sakura seated herself in between the boys and waited until they had their cups in hand before she awkwardly saluted them and Kakashi and took a long sip of her small cup. Perhaps this day wouldn't end in complete disaster, she thought as the warmth of the drink and the atmosphere chased away the hum of violence in her blood and the shiver in her fingers. Sakura woke with a gasp, an animalistic sound making its way out of her throat before she smothered it with her forearm. Flames and blood, green light and deep cold. The winter battle of when? She struggled out of bed, ignored the dizzy feeling in her head, and stumbled up into the cool air of her room. She went to rummage through her drawers with what felt like a boulder seated in her chest. She shouldn't be forgetting these things, these important dates. Seamus, with the silver of his Patronus fox fading as he gurgled up fleshy chunks. Had that been poison or a spell? Ah, there now. She found the correct paper, and here was the notation. Right? It had been a combination of the two, a potion. That's what had taken him. That cold day in February, when the Death Eaters had thrown a small jar at him and the cursed fluid inside had eaten its way into him. She remembered now. Sakura shakily drew her fingers over the words and then let herself sink to the floor. Harry had been there too. Him and Ron, hunched over Seamus' body, urging her to fix it to help their friend, failing to meet that request. And then when the potion opened holes in his chest and stomach, she remembered crying her eyes out like a stupid little child, instead of doing something productive. The phantom touch of her two best friends' arms were around her, and Sakura had to fold the paper and put it away, lest her tears ruin these important memories. She leaned back and softly thumped the back of her head against the wall until her breathing eased. Stupid. She hadn't even known Abe. She had no business having nightmares like this at the event of his death. The gods knew his family would be having enough of those now. Resolutely, she crawled back into bed, folded the covers over herself until they covered every inch of her, and stuffed her hands between her thighs in the vain hope that it would make them stop shaking. Hours later, Sakura sat up in bed, shielding her eyes from the pale morning light, and resolutely pushed the thought of how she'd awakened after a peaceful fall into slumber to the back of her mind. After their visit to the bar, Kakashi had dropped her off at home. He'd spoken a little with her mother, and it wasn't too difficult to guess what about, as Sayuri had seated herself beside her bed as quiet and steady as a statue when he'd gone. Sakura had fallen asleep with her mother's fingers carding through her bangs. As she got out of bed and slowly began preparing for the day, she hoped that Kakashi had gone to visit Sasuke and Naruto as well. They needed it more, and she shouldn't have left them, not even at Kakashi's urging. She wouldn't have, back when she'd been Hermione. Back when her boys had been Harry and Ron. She left with her mother's kiss on her forehead and made her way to the team's usual meeting spot, as Kakashi hadn't mentioned any change in plans even after the dramatic development in their mission. "Good morning, Sakura-chan," said Naruto. It was unusual for him to be here earlier than her, but she was still unsurprised to find him and Sasuke standing there. Both had dark circles under their eyes, though Sasuke's were more pronounced. She imagined his nightmares would have been like her own, with a shade of reality cast over it to make the horror even more pronounced. Kakashi was barely an hour late, and Sakura was deeply thankful for that. The hour they'd waited had been very quiet, and though they'd stood close together in a way they'd never done before, it hadn't felt very intimate. Sakura suspected the boys had been as lost in their own thoughts as she herself had been. "Good morning, my cute little team," Kakashi called in that annoying way of his, and it was actually a relief. Naruto even made some half-hearted attempts to complain at him. "It's time to report to the Hokage, so we mustn't be late," he said, and Naruto complained again, this time about the hypocrisy of that statement. Sakura found it in herself to smile a little, and maybe even admire the way Naruto seemed to be making himself bounce back. Ron used to be able to do that, the only one of their little trio who could. Both she and Harry had been much too good at brooding and worrying. "Was the report from yesterday lacking?" Sasuke asked quietly, and then it occurred to Sakura that it was very odd indeed for them to be seeing the Hokage specifically this morning. Usually they get their D-ranks from a Chunin behind the mission desk. No," Kakashi said unhelpfully, meandering along the road like he hadn't just told them they mustn't be late. Sakura didn't feel like reprimanding him, and though Naruto threw a frown at his back, he stayed silent as well. It took them several minutes longer than it should have to reach the tower, and by the time they knocked on the Hokage's door, Kakashi had his nose stuck in that garish orange book again. Why he wasn't reprimanded by their leader, Sakura couldn't understand. "You haven't had a good night's sleep," the Hokage stated when they'd bowed and greeted him. Genin are not meant to be subjected to death so early on in their careers. His lined eyes were shaded with both sympathy and recognition. Sakura imagined that this wasn't the first time he'd seen Genin deprived of sleep due to the reality of their profession. "We'll pull through, old man," Naruto said, and although his voice sounded shaky and exhausted, Sakura thought she heard certainty in his voice. Something about the way he said it made her feel less uncertain herself, to the point where she bothered to smack him lightly about the head and murmur a reprimand for his way of addressing their leader. "I'm glad to hear that," the Hokage said with a small smile, though his eyes remained darkened, "because I'm afraid I have some news you will not like." Sakura felt a leaden weight settle in her stomach at those words, and Sasuke's already hooded eyes grew darker. Naruto's smile wavered. Their leader proceeded to explain that Abe-san's family had requested a follow-up mission, wanting to know who'd killed Abe and why, and possibly get revenge for his death. They'd requested that the team who found him be the ones to receive this mission, as apparently in their eyes Team 7 were the only ones who would understand their situation. A stupid way of reasoning in Sakura's mind. Normally, I would not have entertained the idea of sending Jinin on such a mission, but the reward they've offered for its completion forced me to consider it. The stunned silence in the room spoke volumes of their thoughts on this sudden turnabout. Of course, you would not be going on what would be considered a B-rank mission alone. In addition to your teacher, 2 members of ANBU would accompany you. 2 ANBU operatives? For a B rank? Thought Sakura with an internal frown. Was he trying to make them feel more at ease, perhaps? Kakashi himself should be enough protection on a mission of this rank, in her mind. But ANBU had a fearsome reputation, and perhaps the Hokage thought they'd be comforted by that. Sasuke was the first to speak up and break the silence. They want revenge for the death of one of their relatives. His voice sounded scratchy, like it was tearing itself out of his throat. Sakura felt her own throat ache in sympathy. Fine. He didn't sound particularly enthusiastic, and Sakura knew there was something deeper behind his agreement. For once, it didn't take much thought to figure out what her teammate was thinking. The old guy didn't deserve to die, Naruto said. And if he hadn't sounded so sincere, Sakura would have glared at him for referring to their dead former client in such a way. Old guy indeed. So yeah, whatever. Naruto sounded even less eager, voice slow and reluctant, and Sakura had to wonder if he was just agreeing so Sasuke wouldn't show him up. But no, she couldn't think that badly of him. He wouldn't be callous enough to turn a person's death into a part of his game of one-upmanship with their teammate. "I suppose this means we're accepting," Sakura said, that small hard smile slipping onto her lips like a knife between the ribs. These stupid and immature boys had no idea what they were signing up for, but she did. And because she knew, she had to come with them. Had to take this mission that made it feel like end of the war Hermione was rising up to lean against the inside of her skin, waiting to break through. She had to be there when they finally realized how bad things could get. "You don't have to," Kakashi said quietly from where he was slouching against the wall. Sakura smiled harder in response, and her hands barely trembled when the Hokage's seal stamped their fates onto the mission scroll. "I've never been out of Konoha," Naruto said a few hours later. The sun lit up the dirt path ahead of them, and the birds chirped, and a gentle breeze sifted through the bright green leaves of the trees lining their way. And Sakura wanted to heck something. The sheer bright normalcy scraped against her insides like steel wool. She took a deep breath and looked over at her blonde teammate. "I have," to distract both herself and her teammates. She told them the story of how she'd accompanied her mother on a large construction project a few years earlier in a close-by village. Her mind remained on the mission more than on that old memory, though. Sakura had recognized the purple-haired ANBU who'd greeted them with a silent nod at Konoha's gates as the one she'd seen at Abe's house. The second one had light brown hair to his chin, and Sakura couldn't for the life of her figure out either of their genders, unless the purple-haired one really was the secretary from the Hokage's office. She hadn't had much time to observe them either, as they disappeared into the trees that lined the path the moment they reached it. Sakura hadn't seen them since. "I have been as well," said Sasuke, and it took Sakura a moment to realize he'd taken up the thread of the conversation. Unusual for him, to say the least, so she turned to listen. "Once I accompanied." There was a pause, and Sakura saw his eyebrows furrow. "My mother, to the Hanrogai fair." She and Naruto traded a glance, though Sakura had only meant to look Naruto's way to see if he realized that Sasuke had done something thoroughly unusual. He'd shared something personal with them, even mentioned his late mother. He'd never made any reference to any relative within her hearing before. Perhaps he became more unguarded when he was sleep-deprived? What was the fare like? Naruto had bounded up to their teammate and bumped his shoulder in that awkward Naruto-ish way of his. Sakura smiled just a little. I've heard of it before, I think, and anyway, I've never been to a fair before. He looked a little grumpy by the end of that sentence, and Sakura noticed that the tense line of Sasuke's shoulders easing. Fine, I guess. I don't remember much of it. Sakura wandered up to walk beside him as well and brushed her arm against his. Though she kept her eyes on the road the whole time, she saw from the corner of her eye how Sasuke's gaze darted her way. A few seconds passed before he suddenly frowned. Stop boxing me in, idiots. He sped up his pace until he was walking quite a bit ahead of them. But Sakura was more surprised that Sasuke had let them box him in the first place than by his sudden withdrawal. Naruto muttered something uncomplimentary, but stayed next to her rather than following Sasuke. Was he trying to give Sasuke space, having realized that he'd just let them in a little? It was difficult to tell with Naruto, who seemed to take turns being stupid and stupidly perceptive. The warmth of the sun and their conversation had sufficiently distracted Sakura from her earlier dark thoughts. So when the dust and debris of an enormous explosion tore up the road ahead and to their right and enveloped Sasuke like a fog in the process, she had to take a second to process what was happening. "Bastard!" shouted Naruto, and that drove Sakura to action. With a kunai in hand, she darted forward, saw a blur in the stirred-up dust cloud ahead, and couldn't decide if it was friend or foe. Her ears rang from the blast, and that horrible cold feeling of war froze her blood. There was the sound of metal against metal to her right, and then again to her left. And up ahead, 3 opponents? More? She threw herself breathlessly into the dust, crouched low under a swinging blade. No, not a blade. White and heavy, and when it met the ground a centimeter from her foot, it looked more like a pike, but Sakura swiped at an ankle wrapped in bandages below the knee pants. Her opponent wielded his weapon like a sword, like it had sharp edges. "Sakura, behind you!" came Sasuke's voice to her side, and thank Merlin he was still alive. She threw herself in the direction of his voice, just as something came down heavy on the ground she'd been standing on, cracking the dry, packed soil like it was nothing. She crashed into someone and nearly put the kunai into his arm before she realized that someone was Sasuke. No, green eyes and glasses, what? No, black eyes. Her teammate had black eyes. "You will not be able to escape us," said a man's voice, the one who'd cracked the ground. He adopted a taijutsu pose, and then his head was promptly split in two. Sakura saw the purple-haired Anbu flip into a tree and then disappear again. But she was distracted by the familiar feel of brain matter and blood and pieces of cranium descending on her like some sort of macabre rain. Sasuke made a choked-off sound, and Sakura pulled him aside as the dust cleared enough for her to see their first opponent, the one with the white sword. Mindlessly, she wiped the bodily fluids from her face, jaw locked and teeth grinding with tension. Dressed almost exclusively in different shades of violet, with long white hair and a rope tied around his waist, he looked like the sort of fashion reject Lavender would have turned her nose up at. Had he taken the time to put on that red eyeshadow and those small red dots over his thin eyebrows before coming to ambush them? Sakura wasn't sure what expression she was wearing when that thought hit her, but it was surely an odd one. "We're not going to escape you, you fucking bastard," Naruto yelled as 2 Naruto clones attacked the young man. One got distracted by the gore on the ground and was summarily reduced to smoke by a swipe of the man's slender white sword, and the second clone only got a bit closer than that before joining to the first in smoky non-existence. Naruto yelled, making more clones as Sakura dragged Sasuke further to the side. Half a minute later, the clones were gone again, and the man stood in front of them, sword raised. He was so much faster than her it wasn't even funny. If only she'd had magic at her disposal. A kunai was a poor substitute, but she met his sword with it and pushed back as he bore down on her. With her other hand, she pulled out her oversized senbon. Chakra pumped through her arms to keep them steady, but the man's expression was unchanging, as was the force of his sword arm. Sasuke came to her aid, his own kunai aiming for the man's other arm. "Trash ought to stay put," their opponent murmured, and suddenly, impossibly, The flesh of his forearm started bulging, like snakes were curling under his skin. Sakura tried to keep her attention on the man's sword, the one that was slowly but steadily coming towards her head despite her blocking it, and the irrational thought that he was a werewolf did pass her mind. But no, it was daytime and sunlight, and this was not England. His natural strength was reinforced with a great deal of chakra, nothing else. So when the bulges pulsed and split to reveal white bone spearing itself out of his flesh, she focused on that instead. No seals, so blood limit had to be. She grunted as pushed down on her harder, as the bones growing like a crown out of his arm lengthened until they were a handspan from her face. Mao, I don't appreciate you bullying my students, said Kakashi, appearing out of nowhere and Tiskinch. His fingers wrapped around a man's upper arm and pulled it from her face, and Sakura simultaneously wanted a hug and hit their teacher. Sharingan Kakashi, their opponent said, tilting his head like a bird as he studied their teacher. Calculation and caution warred for dominance in his eyes. This trash is your dash. Enough with the trash already, Sakura thought, breathed in sharply, and stabbed him in the leg. When his head spun back around to stare at her, she bared her teeth at him, and his glare somehow turned the air around them into something that pressed down on her and made her feel small and scared and like resistance was just futile and… Wait, what? She'd been in the presence of dementors, and this young human stare was nothing compared to the feel of every good and loving memory collapsing inside you until nothing remained but the cold and the despair. And so, fuck this. Sakura glared right back at him, thought of those horrible years of war and all the hastily put-together funerals, and thought again, fuck this. She'd heard of killing intent, of course, and she would not fall under its thrall. Not when she'd already been so useless in this battle. It got easier to breathe, and then Kakashi tugged on the young man's hair and threw him backwards, threw her a quick, eye-crinkled smile, and then followed. She turned to Sasuke to say something, took one look at his pale and sweating face, and realized that not everyone had felt something worse than that killing intent. Touching his shoulder carefully, she called out his name under her breath. They needed to move before another enemy came for them, but she'd read somewhere that you had to bring people out of Ki-induced fear gently. It took several nerve-wracking seconds for Sasuke to look at her, pupils blown so wide she could barely see a thin line of his dark iris surrounding it. "Let's move, Sasuke," she said, and when he nodded, she felt that she could pull him along without causing him to attack her in his fear. Several Naruto clones were standing, looking up at the tree line where Kakashi was still fighting. Sakura frowned at it, because their teacher was definitely much stronger than that young man was. But Kakashi probably had his reasons for drawing out the fight, and as far as she could hear, his was the only fight still ongoing. "Sakura-chan, bastard, you're hurt." A Naruto gasped, and Sakura immediately followed the line of his gaze to see blood running in thin tendrils over Sasuke's hand. Cursing herself, she almost slipped on some bodily fluid or other from the man whose head had been split open when she turned to tend to the injury. It was a sizable gash in his upper arm that might need a few stitches, but it wasn't too bad. "Bandages would do for now," he said. Sasuke started and then coughed. His face was caked with dust and sweat, hair matted and dirty. Sakura imagined she looked about the same. He said something about my eyes. "What are you talking about, bastard?" said Naruto. It was almost funny how he could sound so endearing while insulting Sasuke. Concern widened his blue eyes, and he hovered around them as Sakura cleaned and wrapped their teammates wound. She noticed that he was avoiding looking at the ground, and she couldn't blame him, covered as it was in viscera. The whole road around them looked like something out of a horror movie. "That man, he said he'd come to collect me, that my eyes, something." Sasuke rubbed his brow, frowning. Sakura was relieved to see his face was slowly regaining what little color it usually had. What man? What are you talking about?" Before Naruto could start shouting at an already frayed around the edge of Sasuke, Sakura explained what man he'd been referring to. That quite a few people covet blood limits was something we were lectured on in the academy. If you remember, Sakura said, and Naruto frowned thoughtfully before nodding. "Yeah, something about burning your dead teammates' bodies if they have blood limits, or some special body techniques," Naruto said with frown, and Sakura nodded. I still don't get why someone would want to have someone else's body parts inside them. That's just creepy. That's how you have sex, you realize, Sakura said, which felt a bit crude, but made Naruto splutter in such a way that the strain in the air thawed. Sasuke even snorted, and the fist he'd clenched on his knee unfurled. Sakura-chan. Naruto sounded scandalized, and Sakura had to bite her lip to keep from laughing at his expression. And anyway, that's not what I meant, he finished with, still looking like he was a second away from shouting pervert at her. I know, and I agree, is creepy. But don't underestimate the lengths some people are willing to go to gain more power. The last part she said softly, her hands slowing where they were wrapping the end of the bandage around Sasuke's arm. She would have continued if at that moment Sasuke hadn't decided to turn his head and look at her. In one of his red eyes, a lone comma-like dot spun slowly in a circle. Sasuke, she put a finger to the corner of his eye, and he twitched away from her with a confused frown. Naruto bounced over to look as well, and then promptly tripped over his feet. What? What about my eyes? His gaze was flickering between them, and his brows furrowed harder. It took a second for Sakura to recognize the expression on his face as worry, and she hastened to explain what his eyes looked like. When she was done, Sasuke's eyes had widened, and now he was the one to put fingers to the corner of his eye. Oh, I guess that's why. Why what? Naruto said impatiently. Shouldn't you be more happy about those eyes, bastard? I am perfectly happy, said Sasuke, sounding like the word somehow burned his tongue, and scowled. I could see chakra flicker in that bone sword, so I knew it wasn't a normal sword even before he started. He gestured vaguely. Growing bones out of his arm, Sakura finished. Sasuke nodded, a shade of astonishment in the back of his eyes. Still, being as close to him as she was, Sakura could see the red of his iris was circled by a black line. That explained why she hadn't noticed the red of his irises when his pupils had been enlarged. All right, Naruto said, shrugging a little. Well, you have those eyes now, bastard, so congrats. He punched Sasuke in the shoulder of his uninjured arm, caught sight of something behind them, and then yelled, Kakashi-sensei, bounding away towards their teacher. Though she found his response a tad flippant, Sakura was mostly just relieved that he didn't seem to be jealous of Sasuke's new ability. Perhaps the talk they'd had after she'd carelessly revealed that Kakashi had the Sharingan had stayed with him. She looked over and saw Kakashi with the young man they'd been fighting slung over his shoulder. Naruto greeted him enthusiastically, bloody footprints marking his path to their teacher. The two ENBU appeared on the road as she was looking, carrying two other people. The other enemies, obviously, didn't do much good. Sasuke murmured in the silence of Naruto's departure, and Sakura raised a questioning brow at him, making an inquisitive sound. The Sharingan had faded from his eyes, but Sasuke wasn't looking at her, instead staring down at his bandaged arm with a blank look in his dark eyes. Oh, she got it then, or at least she thought she did. Well, you haven't trained with him yet, have you? She asked gently, and Sasuke snorted again, but sounded off. Before she could say anything further, he rolled his neck and then started walking towards Naruto and their teacher. She would have felt dismissed, if not for the taut curl of his shoulders and the stiffness of his back. She'd have thought activating his clan's blood limit to be cause for celebration, but apparently that was not the case. The wind carried a few more muttered words back to her, half a sentence, and she didn't think he'd meant for her to hear them. He would have been able to. She wasn't sure who he was referring to, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't leave her. With a mental sigh, she righted her shirt and tried to brush some of the dust off. Then she followed him. The bodies of their enemies were sealed into scrolls with seals Sakura partly recognized. A specific kind of containment seal that had been briefly described in the book on Fuuinjutsu she'd taken so many notes of in the library. One to contain living bodies, keep them breathing and unconscious. She couldn't remember the details, but that had been the gist of it. Delighted that she'd been able to discern at least part of a complex seal, she let her thoughts about Sasuke's dark mood trail away and tuned into Naruto and Kakashi's conversation. But Kakashi-sensei, you didn't kill them, so why are you putting them in those scroll things? For interrogation, idiot, Sasuke said with a snort. Sakura thought he sounded a bit distracted though, and he was staring down at his hands with furrowed brows. Naruto made a rude sound and rolled his eyes. That's not what I meant, bastard. He went to poke at one of the scrolls in the ANBU's hands and frowned. Are you really going to carry them around in those things as long as we're on this mission? Don't they need to breathe? Because if they were dead, I get why you'd put them in scrolls, since dead people don't breathe, but Naruto had been talking a lot since their fight ended, words tripping over each other and face faintly flushed. Adrenaline or fear were both still pumping through him, Sakura assumed. She could see the constant chatter was annoying Sasuke, something fierce, but that couldn't be helped. Everyone needed to deal with battle cooldown in their own way. Kakashi drawled an explanation about how the scrolls filtered in air, but Sakura was only listening with one ear. It was odd how familiar it felt, fighting for her life. And yet, how very unfamiliar. It was like she'd been waiting for this, like somewhere in the back of her mind, and despite her growing complacency in the village, she'd had slowly been winding herself up for this day. Intellectually, she'd always been aware of where her kunoichi's path was heading. So why was she so surprised by the feeling of familiarity? Have I been waiting for a fight like this for so long that I started believing that it would never really come? Sakura flexed her fingers around the bloodied kunai she was still holding. Hey, Sakura-chan, did you really stab that guy in the leg? Naruto asked, and Sakura looked up, torn out of her increasingly confused thoughts. What? Yes, I guess I did. She'd never stabbed anyone as Hermione, had she? Melee fights were so rare among wizards and witches that she doubted it. It still bothered her a little that she couldn't remember with certainty, though. And Sasuke-kun here punched him, said Kakashi, eye crinkling in their direction. Sasuke looked up. I saw the bruising, he said lightly. Was he trying to cheer up the brooding Uchiha? My clones punched some guy too, before someone interfered with the fight. Naruto said loudly, obviously not wanting to be left out. He shot one of the ANBU an irritated glare. They were a bit above your pay grade, Kakashi said, humming thoughtfully. I don't suppose the white-haired boy you fought was kind enough to give you some clue as to the reason for their sudden attack, as I passed over them casually. But Sakura thought his gaze lingered a little on Sasuke. Hey, bastard, didn't you say that he said something about your eyes or something? Naruto asked, and Sasuke immediately glared at him. Kakashi prompted him with a raised eyebrow, and Sasuke's fists curled. Something about my eyes befitting his master better than me, he said lowly, grunting. So they came specifically for Sasuke, then Sakura surmised, directing her words to their teacher. She hadn't expected that, had assumed it was because they were Konoha shinobi. Their village's reputation as the most populous of the 5 great shinobi nations meant they had more enemies than most of the other villages, except perhaps for Iwa and Kyumo. Even their respective vassal villages, Takigakure and Shimagakure, weren't too fond of them. Or so she'd heard. They wanted to take his eyes? That's gross. And really bastardly. Naruto's face twisted with indignation, and he plopped down beside Sasuke like he thought someone else might show up to take a shot at getting to their teammates' eyes. Which will probably happen again somewhere down the line, Sakura privately admitted. It wasn't like attempts at acquiring blood limits were uncommon. Her gaze rested on Sasuke, who was in turn focused on Naruto with an expression torn between that dark irritation and something she thought looked a little kinder. How did they know, though? How did they know that we'd be here today? She asked Kakashi, though she doubted he'd know the answer. Maybe they saw us leave? Naruto said, lips pursed before Kakashi could comment. Perhaps he hadn't even intended to answer her, as he was focused on writing something on a tiny scroll he was suddenly holding. That would mean they were in Konoha, or conveniently just outside the village walls the exact moment we exited, Sasuke said, snorting. His eyes were cast in shadow, and his face was the kind of blank that told Sakura he was hiding his true feelings on the matter. The timing is suspicious, Kakashi said slowly, snapping the scroll closed in his hand, but she couldn't read anything what little she could see of his face. If someone from Konoha had been a part of the ambush, Sasuke would be in danger even when they got back from this mission. And to her, it didn't seem like there was any possibility that someone from their village hadn't been involved, perhaps tipped off the group they just fought off as her team left. Or in the worst-case scenario, had tipped them off about Team 7's mission as a whole, in which case their mission had been compromised, all of which she was sure Kakashi himself was considering. Sakura rubbed her hands together and frowned. They had ANBU backing, so she doubted the mission would be aborted. But perhaps she was distracted from her train of thought when Kakashi started weaving hand seals before slamming his palm to the ground. A pale gray dog appeared in the middle of the small black seals that spread outwards from Kakashi's hand. "Shiba, I need you to do something for me." The dog, Shiba, nodded and listened carefully as Kakashi explained that he wanted it to head towards Konoha with the small scroll and hand it to the Hokage. "Shouldn't he take the bodies with him too?" Naruto asked, wrinkling his nose a little. "No." Without further explanation, Kakashi waved the dog away, and Sakura watched as it took off towards Konoha 3 times faster than she herself would have been able to run at this point. Another Nin dog then, though she'd known that the moment she'd spotted the headband around its neck. "Kakashi-senpai, are we continuing?" the brown-haired ANBU inquired, voice monotone but to Sakura's ear, male-sounding. "Yes." His eye passed over them again, and this time Sakura thought he seemed dissatisfied or even unhappy. But Kakashi's gaze was always hard to read, so she couldn't know for sure she wasn't just imagining it. He sealed the scrolls containing the bodies into an even larger scroll, which he then strapped onto his back. Kakashi then handed over their mission scroll to one of the ANBU, and Sakura's eyes lingered on it as it passed hands. The scroll stated that they were to investigate a minor lord currently vacationing in Otafukagai. Whoever had spoken to Abe's relatives had been informed that this lord, Shima Masatake, had been staunchly against some kind of business proposal Abe had tried to negotiate with one of Shima's vassal families. This proposal had evidently caused a considerable amount of resentment on Shima's part when the vassal family had insisted on opening negotiations despite his own vocal dislike. What the scroll did not make any mention of was whether Shima had any shinobi retainers or spies. It seemed unlikely, considering that he was a minor lord with only 3 small vassal families and not a very large fortune to his name. The short biography on Shima, the mission scroll, had included also stated that the man had a rumored gambling problem. It had only been a day since Abe's death, so could he really be behind the ambush they'd just beaten? Could he have hired these shinobi? There was something else, Sasuke said after several minutes passed in silence. He sounded reluctant, drawing the words out between pursed lips. Kakashi turned to look at him, head tilted. A mark between his collarbones. 3 lines pointing outward. Yes. I saw that too. Kakashi scratched idly at his arm, but the sharp air about him made Sakura think he was quite focused. His eye never moved from Sasuke's form. After I punched him, it started moving, and then it withdrew. Sasuke's brows drew together. He said trash like us didn't deserve to witness his transformation. When it moved, did it spread outwards in a growing pattern? The Uchiha nodded, looking up in apparent surprise. So their teacher knew some of what was going on? Or at least recognized whatever mark Sasuke had seen. Kakashi's eye curved in a smile. "It was good of you to share that tidbit, Sasuke-kun. You didn't see the pattern thing, Kakashi-sensei?" Naruto asked, having stared back and forth between their teacher and teammate as they spoke. Kakashi dipped a hand through his kunai pouch and retrieved a protein bar. "I did." Now both Sasuke and Naruto looked confused, and Sakura felt her eyes narrow at the Jounin's casual words. Had that been some sort of test? Or had it become a test only after Sasuke had shared the information? Kakashi couldn't have known about this mark before he fought that young man himself. Perhaps he planned not to share this particular bit of information with them. It doesn't matter now. Onward we go." He clapped his hands, and all 3 of them jerked in response to the sudden sound, ushering them forward across the gore-splattered ground before they could protest or focus too heavily on the leftovers from the fight. Kakashi put them back on their trek towards Otafukagai. Sakura noticed that the body of the man with the split open head had been disappeared, probably by one of the ANBU, sometime in the course of her following Sasuke, and them walking back across the bloody path. Sakura's fingers flexed in agitation. She was going to have to get more observant and a lot stronger, even stronger than she had been the year she died, if she wanted to survive longer than she had back then. She hadn't even had the wherewithal to use any of the simple E-rank seals she'd so carefully transcribed before they left. What was the point of all her Fuuinjutsu reading if she forgot to use what little she'd managed to learn when push came to shove? She forcibly relaxed her hand. It had been too long since she'd last experienced a real fight, but at least she'd managed to stab the man. Who'd have thought the bookworm Hermione would ever stab anyone? Harry, Ron, are you watching me from somewhere behind that ancient veil? Because I think I'm in for quite a ride. Otafukagai was big and noisy, and after the dark silence of their walk here, the change in atmosphere was quite jarring. Kakashi had them stop just outside the city, where the trees began to thin and you could hear the faint din of the city and divest themselves of anything that would mark them as shinobi. Kakashi had taken their headbands and shuriken holsters and hid them somewhere on his person, and then ordered them to turn their larger tool pouches inside out. Sakura had been as surprised as the boys when the insides of their pouches were revealed to be both patterned and dyed differently from each other. They now had them slung over their shoulders in a way that looked a lot like the one-strap backpacks a lot of civilians favored. Even Sakura's mother had something similar that she sometimes carried her larger tools in. Built-in camouflage, then. She should have expected something like that. Are we going to set up a tent in the middle of the city, Sensei? Naruto asked as they walked down the main road, a puzzled expression on his face. We have enough funds to stay the night at a hotel, Kakashi said, and there was some amusement in his voice that Sakura couldn't figure out the cause of. Naruto seemed to take their teacher's reply for what it was and focused on the goings-on at the stand that lined the road. Sakura couldn't quite keep her eyes from darting between the stands either, as it had been quite some time since she'd been out of Konoha. Getting travel permits when you lived in a hidden village wasn't all that easy, so she hadn't seen as much of this world as she'd have liked. Hey, will we have any time to look around? Just a little, Naruto asked, and Sakura turned her head to catch Kakashi's reply. Naruto wasn't the only one who wanted to see more of Otafukagai, as unprofessional as that desire undoubtedly was when they were in the middle of a mission. Even Sasuke was looking interested. Kakashi wasn't shooting Naruto down right away, instead giving them a thoughtful glance. I'm going to find us a hotel, and while I do, you can perform basic recon in the area. Meet me by that statue, he said, indicating a large sculpture of a dancing woman with fans in her hands. They separated then and there, and Sakura assumed that at least one of the A and BU were still shadowing them. She couldn't help but wonder why Kakashi had allowed for this, though. Perhaps he had some side errand to run? Or perhaps he wanted to distract them from the fight and its gory conclusion. Because Sakura still felt stiff, Naruto was still jittery, and Sasuke still too dark-eyed. The most basic reconnaissance was scouting a place's entrances and exits, recognizing hubs of activity and notable buildings and people, and finally making a general threat assessment of the area. It would be a good distraction from the unwelcome mental images she couldn't always push away quickly enough. Well, there's an exit right there, said Naruto, pointing vaguely at a path in the road that swerved to the right and disappeared between two buildings. Most of his attention was on a small stand to their left that sold some kind of meat dishes that Sakura had to admit distracted her a little as well. Perhaps they could have a real lunch today. Idiot, don't point at it, Sasuke said with a sneer. Reconnaissance is supposed to be done discreetly. Not that you would know the meaning of the word, he said, and off they were, arguing all the way to the end of road they were on, more loudly than usual even. So perhaps that was something they needed to keep their own unwanted memories at bay, especially if that was the first time they'd been in a fight like that. Sakura decided not to attempt to break up the squabble just this time. As they walked, Sakura noted two places with a significant amount of people clumped together. One an open door with a sign above it that spelled the old pond, where rows of people were walking in and out. The other a dark cherry pink door further down the road, tucked into a shaded corner from where people were shuffling out in a steady stream. There was no sign above it. Instead, a carving of a willow tree spread its thin, drooping branches across the wood. Her teammates' argument wound down as they reached the end of the road, but they were still glaring at each other when Sakura shared what she'd noticed. She didn't really expect either of the two to have seen anything as caught up in each other as they'd been, but Sasuke had noticed a couple of shinobi at a stand with their back to the road. "Then how do you know they were shinobi?" said Naruto, crossing his arms over his chest, the knots of their headbands at the back of their heads. Sasuke looked on as Naruto huffed, and Sakura nodded. That was a good catch, though she didn't doubt there were more than just those two shinobi in the crowds moving about. Their own team couldn't be the only one purposefully lacking headbands. They headed back at a slow pace, with Sakura pointing out the doors she'd spotted as they passed. Naruto perked up by the old pond and tilted his head as if to catch a faint sound. "Hey, I hear music." Sasuke frowned at him. "I don't hear anything." Naruto had already wandered closer, zigzagging between the crowd of people like an eel in a school of fish. Sasuke and Sakura followed, but it wasn't until they were standing right beside the door, getting cursed at by the people whose paths they were blocking, that she could hear the faint melody coming from within. "I smell carriage," said Naruto, sniffing the air and grinning. "I think they have yakitori too." His stomach rumbled, and he turned to look at Sakura with a hopeful air about him. "I wouldn't mind eating," Sakura said with a smile, and a few minutes later she and the boys were seated around a small table by a window in a large room. All the tables were facing a half-oval stage with a microphone, and as they ordered their food from a stressed waiter who zipped from table to table like a hummingbird, a woman walked up to it. She unfolded a small stool in front of the microphone, the hem of her flowing skirts pooling on the floor as she took a seat. A man handed her a biwa, and she flicked the 4 strings with painted nails before opening her mouth to sing. The monophonic melody did nothing to disguise the beauty of her voice, blending with the biwa's own song. "She's really good," Naruto said, leaning forward. Sasuke was quiet for a moment, holding his glass still in the air, before placing it on the table again with unnecessary conscientiousness. "My mother could play the biwa," he admitted quietly, and Sakura forgot to disguise her expression of surprise as she looked at him. Naruto, too, seemed to sense that Sasuke had done something extraordinary and smiled at their dark-haired teammate in an unusually solemn way. "Was she good?" he asked quietly, and Sakura thought that she probably wasn't the only one who felt like this moment was so fragile that speaking any louder would push Sasuke back into his shell. "Yes, she." His eyes flickered to meet Sakura's, and then to Naruto, and his lips tightened. Whatever he'd been about to say was lost as the steel curtain fell back over his gaze. Sakura said nothing, picking up the kettle of tea and refilling his glass in silence. The unusual revelation from the taciturn Uchiha was perhaps also part of his post-battle response, but then the moment of willingness to share had been broken when he realized the rarity of what he was doing. "I once tried to learn how to play the shamisen," Naruto offered, his clear blue eyes a little unsure and his smile a few notches below full wattage. "I met this really nice lady who offered to teach me. A geisha with hairpins shaped like birds in her hair." He smiled at the memory and then gulped down more tea. "Why didn't you finish learning?" Sakura asked, and Naruto shrugged. "I went back one day and couldn't find her. Some of the other ladies in the Hana district said she'd moved on to something better." He looked only briefly sad at the memory, so Sakura thought this must all have happened years ago. The Hana district in Konoha is more famous for its oiran than its geisha. Their conversation was interrupted by a golden-haired woman at the table next to theirs, wearing a kimono that despite its many layers showed off hints of the curves she possessed. A long, slim kizaru pipe dangled between 2 pale fingers and trail of smoke wafted out in the corner of her painted lips. Naruto stared. Sasuke stared. Sakura resolutely did not cave their heads in. She couldn't have compared with Fleur, but this highbrow, finely boned woman had a touch of the same effect. Sasuke broke his stare after a few seconds, though, looking more annoyed than entranced. Perhaps he'd only been surprised at her interjection. She couldn't say the same for Naruto, though. "Oiran?" Sakura asked, mostly to break the silence. She vaguely recognized that term, though from some book she'd read rather than from an academy lesson. My, what do they teach young ninja these days?" the woman asked, and as she moved, a tattoo of what Sakura recognized as a nighthawk stretched over her collarbone. Oiran, though skilled in ikebana, dance and conversation, share more intimate arts with their customers as well. "Who are you?" Sasuke said, voice brusque. Sakura wasn't sure if he'd caught the implication in her words, or if he was just irritated by the interruption. He jabbed Naruto with his elbow, which made the blonde blink and snapped him out of his staring. "Oh, Hisa, at your service," she said, dipping in a small bow over her cup of sake. Her tone was suggestive, though that might just be to tease them. And what a pretentious way of introducing herself, attaching that suffix to her name. Either she had a seriously inflated ego, or else she actually was important in some way and wanted them to know it. Some powerful person's mistress, perhaps? Naruto perked up. "I'm an idiot," Sasuke interrupted before their teammate could give his name to the stranger. They glared at each other for a moment, and the woman looked on in amusement. There was something sharp in the back of her eyes that Sakura didn't trust, though from the lack of muscle definition in her bared arms, Sakura doubted she was a ninja. Ohisa-san, a wealthy-looking man dressed in a dark blue kimono, walked up to them and blinked at Sakura's team. "Ginzadano," she murmured, and Sakura immediately recognized the name and would have cursed in her mind had that been the kind of thing she was prone to. The daimyo's youngest son. He had a reputation for neglecting his duties, as well as a rumored weakness for prostitutes. Sakura tried not to wrinkle her nose at him when he looked her way. "What beautiful and unusual hair you have, girl," the man said, turned toward her, and casually reached out to touch it. Sakura kept herself from stiffening admirably, and watched as Naruto's mouth opened and Sasuke's lips pursed. Both looked half a second away from protesting on her behalf, and that made Ginzu's presumptuous touch grate less on her nerves. "What is your name?" "Sakura, my lord," Sakura said, relieved for once that her name was so common. Naruto stared at her in confusion when she shared her name, but closed his mouth around whatever he'd been about to say. "It suits you very well," he said, patting her head and smiling like he was granting her a favor, but like she was a dog. Under the table, Sakura's hands slowly clenched into fists. She would have pulled away if not for Sasuke's fingers closing around her wrist like he'd sensed the change in her mood. Her other hand was enfolded in one of Naruto's warm ones, and suddenly Sakura felt light enough to soar. These weren't her boys, weren't Ron and Harry, but oh, how similar they felt in this moment. She could almost hear the echoes of their reassuring voices in her mind. "Should I be jealous, Ginzadano?" Ohisa asked, voice demure and eyelashes sweeping a shadow over her high cheekbones. Sakura doubted that her question was meant seriously, but it made Ginzu turn back to her with a smile. "Oh no, your beauty is beyond comparison, my dear. But cherry blossoms have their own charm." He kissed the knuckles of the slim hand Ohisa offered him. How pure-blooded of her, Sakura thought, and waved away the mental image of Pansy Parkinson's snooty expression that flickered over Ohisa's face. Parkinson looked nothing like this woman, hadn't had a shred of her beauty or grace. But that expression, "because they fall we love them, the cherry blossoms." Ohisa's voice was a croon, a hum. She twirled a lock of her golden hair between her fingers as she recited. "In this floating world, does anything endure?" That was definitely a poem, or part of a poem. Sakura had transcribed enough poetry from memory these past few years to recognize the melodious fall of a recitation. She'd also been bullied enough to recognize a veiled insult when she heard one, no matter how dressed up in flowery language it was. From the amused flicker in the Lord's eyes, he recognized it too. Stupid purebloods. Except there were no purebloods here. The wealthy, influential, and beautiful were just as used to casually treading over everyone else as in her old world. Sakura thought back to the last poem she'd translated, the one her mother had praised. She thought about how always being the sensible one in any group sometimes got to her. She thought about how they were anonymous right now, in a town full of anonymity. Then she opened her mouth to give back as good as she got. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. She began and recited the poem as gracefully as she could, conscious of the fact that her voice didn't fall as smoothly as Ohisa's had, and that engaging some random woman in a poetry contest of all things was perfectly ridiculous. She spoke the poem's last two sentences in a soft voice. "So dawn goes down today, nothing gold can stay." There was a silence in the wake of her words, and Sakura fought back the rising blush in her cheeks. What the hell was she doing? The poems were for her, She wasn't supposed to be clubbing other people over the head with them, just because she was feeling snippy, and maybe still a bit rattled from the first fight she'd experienced since she died. But Ginzo looked pleasantly surprised, and Ohisa's eyebrows were high on her forehead. Her teammates seemed confused, and in Sasuke's case, also somewhat impressed. Lovely. So he wasn't impressed enough with her shinobi skills to consider her a rival, but her skills at reciting bloody poetry was enough to earn her an interested glance. "I'm not familiar with this stanza," Ohisa said, her large eyes as dark and shining as pools of oil. Painted lips quirked in an expression that called to mind some slippery feline animal hiding either a wildcat's fangs or a housecat's friendly headbutt. She couldn't tell which. "It's not a famous one," Sakura agreed, paused, and then explained herself to be its maker. It still felt indecent, claiming someone else's work as her own. "That is most impressive, girl," Ginza said, but Sakura's only pleasure was the slight narrowing of Ohisa's eyes. "Say, is your group free to move?" "I'm afraid not," Sasuke said smoothly in her place. "Our guardian wishes for us to return to him within the hour." "Your guardian? You are related?" Sakura wondered why this man assumed they would answer a stranger's questions, considering that he hadn't actually introduced himself. Or was he just so used to people recognizing him that he assumed everyone he came across would? "It's none of your business," said Naruto, putting his glass to the table a bit too loudly. Both he and Sasuke stood up, and Sakura wasn't sure whether to join them or try to make them sit back down to avoid causing a scene. More of a scene than she'd already caused herself. "Is there a problem here, sirs, madams?" A woman in a starched uniform sidled to their side, an obsequious smile on her face and her hands clasped in front of her. "We were just leaving," said Sasuke, put several bills on the table, and then ushered her past a sputtering Ginzu and a carefully blank Ohisa. "Girl, if you're willing to recite more of your poetry, my company is staying at the Hankyu Resort. Make sure you leave your impolite friends behind, and we'll have a splendid evening together. Feel free to bring guests with you, if they share your talent for poetry." He sounded like he was expecting her to take him up on the offer, voice laughing as he called after them. Sakura hoped the Hankyu was far away from where they were staying, as she did not want to run into the lord they'd just abruptly walked away from anytime soon. Who knew how he might react if he found out they were from Konoha? In her experience, the wealthy had egos as fragile as sparrow eggs, even when they seemed good-natured. Out in the street, they moved deep into an alley and watched for any sign that they were followed. "That was weird," Naruto said, frowning at the mouth of the alley. "But that poem of yours was really good, Sakura-chan." I didn't really understand it, but it was beautiful." Sakura smiled at his sincerity, but then shook her head. "I shouldn't have done that. The man, Ginzo Dano, is the daimyo's youngest son." "I realized," Sasuke said with a nod. He was still frowning. "I just like the vibes he gave off." "Me too. He shouldn't have patted Sakura's hair like that, the prick." Then Naruto blinked. "Wait, he's the daimyo's son?" He looked all rich, and the way he talked sounded really posh, but I didn't recognize him. "He's the youngest son, so there's no reason you would." Sakura pushed her fingers through her hair, feeling strangely tired all of a sudden. They'd have to report this to Kakashi, and she'd have to explain that she was the one to create this mess. "But both of you did." Naruto looked down at his toes. "I'm gonna have to start reading more," he said with reluctance, apparently to himself, before sighing explosively. "Let's head back," Sasuke said, his focus on the people passing by the alley. Sakura and Naruto turned to follow him, and then they made their way back towards the place they'd split from Kakashi on a side road that wasn't connected to the one that housed the old pond. They waited by the sculpture of the dancing woman until Kakashi showed up, slouching towards them with his hands in his pockets. He was dressed in a simple gray kimono, with his Sharingan hidden behind an eye patch and his silvery hair tied down. He looked strangely naked without his headband, even if he donned a scarf to substitute for his mask. He still looks suspicious, Sakura reflected, and weird. "I found us a hotel," was the first and only thing he said, and then Naruto opened his mouth and in a loud whisper started explaining who they'd met and what had happened. The Jounin's expression never changed, though he sighed a little when Naruto's explanation ground to a halt. "For next time, Naruto, Wait to make your reports until we're somewhere isolated. A half-lidded, I turned to look at Sakura, whose shoulders tensed a little as she waited to be rebuked. It's unusual for you to be the center of these things. I guess you're more like your teammates than I assumed. He finished, slowly scratched the back of his neck, and then gestured for them to follow him. That was less than Sakura had expected, though perhaps he wanted to be alone with them before he began chewing them out. Kakashi led them to the door of building that Sakura would have called nondescript if not for the bright red window frames. "Is this our hotel?" Naruto asked, and the Jounin hummed agreeably at the question. Sakura stared at the garish decor, all frills and overly large ornate mirrors, coupled with an unfortunate tendency to combine bright reds with bright purples. "Kakashi-sensei," she said slowly as they passed a gaggle of laughing young women orbiting a man wearing too much gold jewelry. "What kind of hotel is this, exactly?" Kakashi gave her the kind of look a well-fed, well-satisfied cat might give you. "Our funds didn't stretch as far as I thought, but no worries. There are even less reputable hotels in this town." "That's not very reassuring, Kakashi-sensei," said Naruto, and darted to the side to avoid a drunk elderly woman escorted by a very well-built dark-skinned man wearing a see-through shirt. "Sensei, is this a sex hotel?" Naruto asked bluntly, staring after the two as they passed. Kakashi stared lazily at him over his shoulder. "I think the owners of these establishments prefer them to be known as love hotels," he drawled. He stopped outside of the door, unlocking it with a key card and leaning his hip on it to let them into the room. "We're staying in a brothel," Sasuke said flatly when they were inside. Kakashi slumped down on one of the king-size beds. "Ma, it's a hotel. People do occasionally stay here, just because it's cheap and clean. Occasionally. Not very often, but it does happen." Sakura saw Kakashi's mouth quirk behind the layer of cloth. Sasuke looked ready to lunge at his throat. Sakura rubbed her forehead with the heel of her hand and wondered what in the world Kakashi was thinking. Perhaps this was the hotel they'd be able to remain hidden the easiest? But then, they were 3 children and an adult in a love hotel. Wouldn't that look both suspicious and illegal to outsiders? Then again, this might be the kind of place that took care not to look too closely at its clientele. She resolved not to ask for once, because their teacher was a Jounin and surely he knew what he was doing. Unless he just wanted to discomfort them as some kind of lesson. Though it wasn't like she'd never dealt with prostitutes as Hermione. War brought poverty, and poverty brought people to the brink of desperation. Desperate times called for desperate measures, especially if you had children to feed. Sakura shook away the dark thoughts of hollow-eyed women walking the streets of Nocturne and occasionally Diagon Alley, and turned back to watch Naruto call their teacher a pervert and a lout. Kakashi bopped him on the head with a smile, and then motioned for them to sit down. "As long as Ginzu didn't recognize you as Shinobi of Konoha, I doubt the situation will cause further problems." "Naruto, you never explained exactly why the Lord invited Sakura back to his hotel." The implied question was seemingly directed towards Naruto, but Kakashi's one visible eye rested on Sakura. Naruto grinned at her. "Oh, Sakura-chan had this poem that he really liked, and he wanted to hear more." "A poem?" Kakashi looked like he wasn't sure whether to believe that or not. But when both Sakura and Sasuke nodded in agreement, he sank his chin into his hand and hummed thoughtfully. "I'm pretty sure Lord Shima is part of Ginzu's retinue," he said. Sakura drew in a breath she hoped wasn't too noticeable. He wasn't saying that she'd caused them general inconvenience by making herself memorable to someone close to their target. She heard, in Kakashi's words, another implication. This is a viable way to approach Shima. The only reason she'd even recited that poem was because Ohisa had acted so pure-blooded and she'd let herself be provoked, but she'd never have acted on the impulse if she hadn't been so sure it was very unlikely that they'd ever cross paths again. "Kakashi-sensei, we can't do that. That guy's a complete creep." He shook his head fast enough to make his blonde bangs fly back and forth. Sakura thought to herself that Ginzu had been less of a creep and more of a condescending jerk, but didn't comment. At that remark, Sasuke drew himself up, looking like he had to make himself speak. "I don't like it either." Kakashi watched them lazily, tilting his head so his gaze could encompass them all. His voice was dry when he spoke. "You seem to have forgotten that this is a mission we've been assigned to complete." Unless you are protesting because you feel that Ginzu's too much of a threat for this course of action to run smoothly, this is what we'll do. And that was apparently that. It was difficult to argue with the Jounin when his voice came out like the edge of Kanai, and so they begun preparing for the mission immediately. It wasn't like this wasn't a good way to reach their target, but Sakura still wished. She wasn't sure what she wished, really. Do we need soldier pills? Or panch rest pills? She overheard Naruto murmuring to Sasuke, who snorted quietly in reply. Both of the boys moved about the room with purpose, Sasuke with a deep crease between his eyebrows and Naruto with an uncharacteristic frown. You don't always have to be such a bastard, the blonde said and shoved a set of soldier pills into his pocket. His gaze caught on hers, and he smiled, weakly. Sakura knew what they were thinking, of course. Naruto refused to call the Lord by name, referring to him only as the creep. But she hadn't felt like Ginza meant to pay her that kind of attention. It wasn't like she'd never been around men of those particular inclinations before her death, and she thought she had a pretty good grasp on how their gazes usually fell on girls her age. A dark voice in the back of her mind warned her against leaning on that assumption too heavily in case Ginza did indeed have special plans for her, and so she secured an extra pair of her long sunbon to her calves. A necklace with small heart-shaped glass vial of poison was clasped around her neck, the glass thin enough to be easily broken between her fingers and stupid-looking enough that it hopefully wouldn't cause suspicion, even if it was noted that she hadn't been wearing it before. "Sakura-chan, you could have protested a little more, you know," Naruto said, wandering up to her while strapping kunai to his forearms. Sakura smiled at him, at his worry, and pushed away the slight resentment his avid concern brought. If she'd been Sasuke, he'd probably just have punched her in the shoulder and made some comment about how they were going to get the creep easy. Naruto didn't mean to imply that she wasn't strong enough. Sakura knew that, so she smiled even wider into his worried blue eyes and then reached out to bop him on the nose. He made a startled sound and hopped back a step. "It'll be all right. I'm only going to recite a few more poems for him and his company," she said. But Naruto only rubbed his nose and eyed her like he was entertaining the idea to wrap her in bubble wrap. At least that's what he said. Naruto mumbled, and Sakura turned away with a sigh to tie a spare bandage around her thigh. It was the especially absorbing kind that Mizuki-sensei had introduced her to when he discovered that she only had the same kind of bandages civilians used. After fastening it firmly, she turned her attention back to the conversation. He was with a grown woman and seemed quite interested in her curves. "You have curves, too," he protested, seemingly without thinking. Because Sakura herself turned to stare at him, she really shouldn't have felt so irritated when Sasuke did the same, wearing an expression as incredulous as she imagined her own was. So what if she was a little flat? She'd barely entered puberty yet. Besides, large breasts would mean that she'd have to use a binder, and what the hell was she thinking about in the middle of a mission? Naruto looked nervously at her. "I mean, you look nice. Nice enough, a dash." It was difficult to stay annoyed with Naruto. Sakura was discovering. Keeping her lips from twitching, she continued on his sentence. To catch the attention of a pedophile, Naruto blinked, blue eyes wide as a startled deer's. "I didn't mean it like that. I just meant you're shapely. I've seen that." Naruto looked proud of his save at first, but then the expression fell into dismay when he realized what he'd actually said. "What?" Sakura had never been particularly prone to casual violence, like the Yamanaka girl who liked to punch people who got in her way, or Ami who used spars to pick on the weaker members of their class. But if Naruto meant that he'd looked at her when she was changing, she was going to punch him. She had certain boundaries, and those included not feeling like she had to take precautions so her teammates wouldn't peep on her. Naruto rapidly opened and closed his mouth before suddenly seeming to deflate. "I just meant that I noticed you look nice. I didn't mean it in a creepy kind of way." He looked at her like he was expecting a strike. And how could Sakura disbelieve him when his sincerity was so glaringly obvious? "Okay, thank you then. For the compliment," she added when Naruto looked at her in surprise. There was a moment of silence, where Sasuke watched them blankly and Naruto still looked a bit nervous. Though Sakura didn't want to push too hard, she couldn't help but continue. Because, she cleared her throat, thought that she didn't want to sound like she suspected him of anything. and then continued, "It's not funny to be looked at when you're in a vulnerable state, because months before the battle that truly marked the end of the war, she and Harry and Ron had been traveling a larger group than just the three of them, and there'd been so little privacy, and, well, not everyone on your side were the kind of people you truly wanted at your back if you had a choice." Sakura shook away the useless memory with a hasty mental shrug. Awkwardness made her stand stiff, wondering if it was old memories or her own uncertainty about Ginzu that was guiding her tongue. But Naruto nodded seriously, looking like he was half a second away from another sincere declaration. "We're not going to do anything like that," said Sasuke, flatly, like the words didn't matter, and with his eyes turned towards his upper arm, where he was attaching a kunai. Naruto nodded firmly. "Yeah, we're not creeps." Kakashi poked his head back into the room, leaning a forearm on the door jamb. "That's good to hear, but I'm more interested in whether you're ready to go yet." Sakura almost didn't recognize him, with his hair a dull black and a lot less voluminous than before. It was sort of limp-looking, really. "Ugh, Sensei, you're always just disappearing, and what happened to your hair?" Thoroughly distracted, Naruto gaped at the jounin. Kakashi threw him a flat glance and didn't answer. "We're ready," said Sasuke. Sakura nodded, securing the end of the bandage and standing up straight. The introduction to the common shinobi first aid tools was one of the first and most useful things she'd ever been taught in the academy, since she hadn't known nearly as much Muggle first aid as she should have when she died. Mizuki had taught that class, and he'd been very thorough. She hadn't seen him for a while now, come to think of it. Maybe she should stop by the academy sometime after the end of this mission. The team trotted out into the corridor, and again they bypassed hotel guests and underdressed employees and went out into the street. The sky was a patchwork of orange and pink, and the shadows had lengthened. More people milled about, and certain shops were starting to light the lamps outside their doors, giving the streets a dim red glow. "Can we eat on the way?" Naruto asked, and eyed some takoyaki a street vendor was waving in a man's face. The vendor ended up cursing loudly at him when he rolled his wheelchair away without buying anything. "You couldn't really expect better customer service than that in this neighborhood," Sakura supposed. "Go ahead," Kakashi muttered, and Sakura realized that in addition to his hair, his voice had changed. Now that she looked closer, there was something about his way of walking that was strangely unfamiliar as well. He'd probably done infiltration missions 1,000 times before. Naruto bounced ahead, paying for a box of takoyaki with money from a bulging frog-shaped wallet. He snatched one up right away and seemed to swallow a whole, giving a shiver of pleasure, and then held out the box to Sakura. When she'd taken one, he reluctantly tilted the box in Sasuke's direction too. Looking a bit surprised, Sasuke accepted the treat. "There, that's Hankyu," Kakashi said a few minutes later, pointing at a large building at the end of the street. It was a traditional-looking mansion big enough to compete with some of the larger buildings she'd seen in Konoha, surrounded by low walls made of white stone. They made their way towards it, and when they reached the guards by the entrance, Kakashi tilted his head at them, and they let Team 7 in without comment. As she passed, Sakura saw their eyes were strangely glassy and wondered if Kakashi had used the Sharingan, or if he'd just concealed his use of hand seals. The foyer was as spacious and ostentatious as the outside had hinted at. There was a scattering of plush couches around, with a few guests seated and in low conversation. Kakashi steered them towards the reception area, where a handful of people were speaking into phones or to guests from behind a half-moon desk of darkwood. "We were invited," said Kakashi to one of the receptionists, and explained their errand in a careful voice very different from his usual drawl. "I will call Ginzadano's room to confirm your words. If you'll hold on but a moment." The receptionist's 100-watt smile never wavered as he spoke, and then picked up the receiver, and Sakura glibly wondered if he had any serial killer tendencies. There was something eerie about that shiny smile. He repeated Kakashi's words to the person on the other end of the line, and then smiled even brighter at them when he hung up. "You are all welcome to meet with Ginzadano in the entertainment hall. I'll send refreshments along shortly." A tiny yukata-clad woman appeared at Kakashi's elbow and steered them towards the entertainment hall. They passed a number of wealthy-looking guests who, in contrast with the people at Team 7's own hotel, were all thankfully wearing clothes. The moments before they crossed the threshold, Kakashi bent down to murmur in her ear. Whatever the situation with Ginzu, you're not cleared for sex-centered infiltration. If you feel that you might be put into a situation that would require those particular skills, you are to alert me immediately. It was both reassuring and not. Sakura hadn't felt like she was in the presence of a predator, but the boys had been concerned, and now Kakashi was giving her such specific orders. Not for the first time, Sakura wished she still had her magic to rely on, or even that she'd come closer to figuring out how to use seals effectively. Everything in the room they entered had been polished until it gleamed: walls, floor, furniture. Sakura marked the exits as subtly as she could. The entrance they'd just come from, a small red-painted door with gold details tucked into a corner that Sakura assumed was for staff, and an archway at the far end of the room made of what seemed to be a gathering of branches loosely braided together. "Sakura-san," Ginzu called from a large sofa he was slumped into. Ohisa was seated to his left, her slender hand resting on his arm. To his right was a svelte young man dressed in a similar way to Ohisa, curled up against an older man who had the same wealthy and entitled air about him as Ginzu had. Fanning out from the two of them and their cohorts were other men and women, all with companions of their own. "Hello," Sakura greeted when her team approached, and tried not to stare at the way one of the women was caressing one of the men under his shirt. In public, she tried to focus on the fact that at least there were no children here, like she'd heard wasn't too uncommon in water country. Sit, Ginzu said and gestured towards a mostly unoccupied sofa opposite himself. A lone woman sat on the wide armrest, but she was looking through a set of folders and wearing enough layers of clothing that only the tips of her fingers were visible. Some kind of personal aid, Sakura thought, and sat down. Sasuke and Naruto placed themselves at her sides, and Kakashi folded himself into place next to the woman, who barely spared him a glance. "I was just telling my associates about your skills as a poet." "I'm honored," said Sakura, and felt Ohisa's eyes on her like the eyes of a shark. "Allow me to introduce my family." She called Kakashi her uncle, and Sasuke and Naruto her cousins. Large extended families were not unusual in hidden villages, and since Ohisa was already aware of their origin, this had been decided upon as their cover. "Ah," they bristled, "so at my invitation, I'm surprised you could make them accompany you." Ginzu smiled widely. "They're a bit overprotective," said Sakura, which was only the truth. "But they mean well. Please forgive their impoliteness." It was an empty, smoothing phrase. "There's nothing to forgive." He made an expansive gesture and puffed up a bit. "I understand the impulse. You never know what kind of people you might run into in this town." "Right," said Sakura, and tried not to look too incredulous, as she avoided looking directly at the various indiscreet displays of affection going on around her. They made small talk for several more minutes, and then Ginzu magnanimously ordered them snacks. "But forgive me, I meant to introduce you." Ginzu leaned back with a smile as they were served various beverages and pieces of expensive-looking chocolate. "You've already met the delightful Ohisa, but the man to my right is Ashinobu." He gestured to the older man like the younger man in between them wasn't even there. "The woman at the far end of your couch is Yukiji." Then there was a brown-haired older woman on the couch to their left named Takaho, and two men called something or other. The list went on as more people were introduced, until finally Ginza motioned to a short man, seated on a chair a touch away from the crowd. "And this is Shima Masatake." Sakura glanced at him only briefly, but committed his face to memory. Their target was middle-aged, straight-backed with few wrinkles and an unsmiling mouth. Naruto had received strict instructions not to stare should Shima's name come up in conversation, and Sakura was glad to see that he looked as unaffected as Sasuke did. Ginzu grew silent as the introductions finished, taking a sip of his drink. Sakura couldn't help but notice that he hadn't mentioned the names of any of his group's companions, barring Ohisa. He acted as if they were all but invisible. Like they're pretty pieces of decoration, Sakura thought with a quickly smothered flush of anger. "So, might we hear a poem or two from you tonight, young lady?" said Ashinobu, whose name Sakura faintly recognized from somewhere. "If you wish," said Sakura. though she didn't want to share any of her treasured memories of home with these people. She glanced around the table, but maybe she could share them with their overlooked company. Stand, stand, said Ginzu, and Sakura held herself back from frowning at his imperious tone. She stood, brushing imaginary lint from her clothes, and moved towards the unoccupied side of the table they were all seated around. As she did so, she flipped through the rosters of poems she still knew by heart, considering her options. Nothing controversial, too long, or anything with references to the world she'd left behind. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all, she began, trying to ignore the feeling of so many eyes upon her. As she recited Emily Dickinson in a voice she hoped did the poem justice, she noticed that the young woman seated next to their target looked to be on the young side. Mid-teens at most. The girl wasn't doing anything seductive, but she was sitting so close to Shima that Sakura felt a chilly, queasy anger begin to burn in her stomach. It shouldn't have, because at 10-11-12, they'd had lessons about the flowerily titled bedroom arts in the academy, carefully designed to sound less alarming than Sakura thought the idea of children in any adult's bed should be. Of course, they'd also emphasized that nobody ranked below special jounin were ever sent out on such missions, that to be considered for such a mission, one had to pass an examination, that one could still opt out of ever acquiring that specialty. And all Sakura had been able to think was that she knew of several famous Konohanin who'd graduated young and become full jounin before they hit their teens. Kakashi was only one such example. It was difficult because Sakura was so used to overthinking everything, but she sometimes actively tried to avoid considering just how far Konoha was willing to go on their leader's say-so. How willing to reforge even the most basic of human decencies, if only they were given an order to do so. Logically, she tried to reason having children kill was far worse than other things. She never could get that sentiment to stick, though, if only because if she had to choose between a child of hers killing or prostituting themselves for a mission, she would choose the former in a heartbeat. At least then, they would never have to make themselves vulnerable and at the mercy of strangers, unless they made that personal choice for themselves. The acceptance of an order after a lifetime of careful, sometimes even gentle, indoctrination was not a true choice. But those weren't the kind of thoughts a shinobi ought to entertain, and so she tucked them away, as she'd done many times before. Sakura finished speaking and bowed at the waist as the gathering clapped. Several of them were smiling at her, but Sakura was glad Shima's mouth remained serious. He was making circles over the girl's hip bone now, and she looked away. "Another one of your own, I take it?" Ginzu asked with a smile, and Sakura made herself return it. Ohisa was looking at her from through her lashes, and something knife-like hung about her painted mouth. "You're talented, girl," Ashinobu said, and Sakura tried not to let the way he sounded like he was talking to a talented dog bother her. "I do believe we have someone equally talented in attendance, however." He turned to look at Ohisa. "If you would grace us with a stanza, my dear." Ohisa approached the table, still with that edged smile, and made a slight bow in Sakura's direction. "For someone so young, you are quite talented," she said before she swept by, straightened her back, and spoke. "In the dawn light, I can't parse my dreams from reality." It was a short poem, but recited with such skill that it sounded heavy with meaning Sakura didn't think she'd have heard in the words otherwise. Some other time, in some other place, she might have enjoyed listening to it. For what felt like an eternity, Sakura and Ohisa took turns presenting one poem after another, and Sakura made sure to only speak the sweetest, calmest of her memorized little masterpieces. The young man leaning against Ashinobu was smiling a little at her, and Sakura was glad someone out of Ginzu's ring of jumped-up associates had seemed to like what she had to offer of now non-existent poets' works. "You should consider publishing your pieces sometime," Ginzu said when she was finally seated again. Ohisa had an odd considering look in her eyes, less hostile but heavier. "Our family is in the trading business," said Kakashi and smiled behind his scarf. "But she's never shown much of an interest in her father's line of work. She takes after her artist mother, my sister." "What kind of artist is your sister?" Shima asked after the rest of the company merely hummed or smiled in response. An opening, finally. Sakura had no wish to redo the poetry routine, or indeed engage herself in discussion with a man who was currently stroking the teenage girl's lower back. The thought was a useless one, considering she'd definitely be spending time making nice with worse people than Shima over the course of her career. I have made nice with worse people, Sakura thought to herself, forcing her body to relax. She'd shared honeyed words with Death Eaters for Merlin's sake. Sometimes Sakura wished for the ease of hexing someone instead of out-talking them. It was a very appealing, Ron Weasley kind of thing to think. "She's a painter," said Kakashi, and after a beat of silence, "Are you interested in art?" "Ah, Shinma-san here deals in ceramic wares," Ginzu said, and Sakura got the feeling he just didn't like being out of the focus of attention. Their target nodded, and Sakura imagined seeing the cogs in Kakashi's lightning-fast brain spinning as he thought of a way to work that angle. "Cool," said Naruto, and Sakura saw Sasuke move to crush their teammates' toes with his heel. Sakura found herself reluctantly impressed when the blonde's expression didn't change, even when his whole leg tensed up in pain. "Do you have any stuff like that here?" "Stuff like that, indeed." Ginzu's grin was bordering on outright laughter, and Sakura caught Ohisa looking amused. Some tension she hadn't even been aware of seemed to break with Naruto's straightforward question. "Shima-san, you have some of those teapots by Ogata Kenzan with you, don't you?" "Yes," said Shima, who looked unamused at the idea of entertaining Naruto's apparent curiosity, but unwilling to deny Ginzu. "I've heard of Ogata Kenzan," Sasuke said, voice strictly neutral. Sakura imagined he was trying not to sneer at the man. "My family has a tea set made by him." It was impressive how little he hesitated before using the word family in the present tense. "My older brother was always fond of collecting ceramics," Kakashi said musingly. And thus the entire company was ushered into another room by an enthusiastic Ginzu. Sakura trailed after Kakashi, last in the group. It was purely by chance, but an obvious stroke of luck because once Sakura took a step over the threshold, the entire door frame shuddered. Like someone had pulled on a harp's strings. All the individual branches that made up the graceful arch shook. Before Sakura could react in any conscious way, warmth burst through her body, like sunlight on her skin after the coldness of night. And Sakura couldn't make a sound as the profound sense of recognition shot through her. With her heart beating like a taiko drum against her ribs, she stared up at the crown of the frame, with a slender wood that she'd first assumed was a tangle of gnarled branches knotted together. How could she have forgotten the look of vine wood? Sakura was almost afraid to touch it, for fear it would react further. But to feel like a witch again, Sakura, Kakashi called in that fake voice of his, and Sakura was of half a mind to ignore him. When reality reasserted herself, she was in the middle of a mission, one that was a consequence of several people's deaths. She would never have ignored a self-imposed mission as Hermione, and she couldn't ignore an officially sanctioned one as Sakura. It still felt like a betrayal of herself to walk slowly through that arch of wood and leave it behind. "I'll return," Sakura thought fiercely, pulse racing so hard in her veins she could feel it beat in her jugular. "And when I leave this place, I'll leave with half of what's needed for a wand. A piece of magic. A piece of home." She caught up to Kakashi and smiled faintly at his unreadable look. His visible eye swept the archway, and then he turned to catch up to the rest of the party. Her chest felt like it was going to explode, like her lungs were going to burst. Magic. She still had it, even if she hadn't been able to feel it again until now. And that old, hidden sliver of thought that she might never have been Hermione, that it was all just a cruel jutsu or an overwhelming personal delusion, could finally be put to rest. She never really let herself nourish that doubt, because even as the years went by in this world and she couldn't find any trace of magic, she'd remembered how she got here. The snarl of time-turners braided together, choking the life out of her without Hermione ever fighting back. "All right, Sakura?" Kakashi asked, pitching his voice low, and Sakura was quick to nod. She was perfectly all right if her heart would just stop beating so hard with all the hope she shouldn't be allowing herself just yet. In a daze, she looked on as Shima unwrapped and pointed to 4 different pieces of ceramic work and listened blankly to his explanation of their origins. He stopped sculpting around 5 years ago, disappearing off the face of the planet after making this last piece. It helped that Shima had the kind of droning voice Sakura had previously only thought Professor Bin's capable of. "Are you selling?" Sasuke asked, tilting his head in a way that made him look somewhat aristocratic. Like he could afford to ask that seriously. "To the right buyer, yes." Shima's voice was slow and thoughtful, and he gave Sasuke a sideways glance. Sakura made herself focus on the conversation, pushing down the weighty hope and sheer disbelief she was starting to drown in. Sasuke bent down to look at one of the teapots, inspecting the bamboo pattern like he knew what to look for. "My family might be interested. As I said, we already have one of his previous pieces. Unless Konoha is out of your way," added Kakashi, voice and body apologetic. He shot Sasuke an obvious warning glance, looking to appear like he wanted to make sure his nephew didn't offend a man. Shima hesitated, arm curling around the teen girl's waist, before nodding. "I hadn't planned to travel there for quite a while yet, but for a buyer, I could make an exception." It was a bit odd that a man with long-time dealings in trade would jump like that for a potential buyer, and Sakura doubted she was the only one to think so. "That would be appreciated," Kakashi said, looking so hesitant that in the back of her head, Sakura marveled at his ability to act. It was like looking at someone else entirely. "But we don't want to make you go out of your way." Shima assured them that he wouldn't mind traveling with them, as he had friends along the road to Konoha anyway, and they agreed to journey back to Konoha together. Sakura noted Ginzu's drawn brows and wondered if it was just the lack of attention again. Her eyes caught his, and she watched as his expression immediately morphed into a smile. If she hadn't caught the look just before that, she'd have thought him completely sincere. Then again, he did grow up in the daimyo's court, Sakura thought. He must know how to fake a pleasant mood. That was one of those things all nobles seemed to know how to do. Maybe it was a survival tactic, as the infighting among the nobility was historically as bad here as it had been in her old world. "Taking my guess from me, Shima-san," Ginzu said with that smile still in place. "Ah, well, I suppose it can't be helped. But won't you stay the night at least?" Sakura saw Naruto's mouth open and then close, a fierce look temporarily on his face before he caught himself and scrubbed it off. "We couldn't impose," Kakashi demurred, but Ginzu insisted that he had spare rooms reserved in the hotel, that they could enjoy a nice breakfast together tomorrow morning before leaving, that it would be a shame to end their meeting so abruptly after such an enjoyable evening. Kakashi agreed, in the end. "Sakura, you and your fiancé will room together." He nodded toward Sasuke, all casual, but Sakura felt like he'd just thrown up a shield between her and Ginzu's coterie. "Cousin courtship?" asked Ohisa with a smile. Ginzu grinned at them and made an enthusiastic gesture, and Sakura called to mind that like historic European aristocrats, the nobles of Fire Country tended to intermarry. The current daimyo was the child of a second cousin marriage, if she wasn't mistaken. "Yes," said Kakashi, "Sakura is my sister's oldest, and Kinsuke here is my brother's youngest. When they turned 12 a few weeks ago, we made it official." Ohisa smiled wider, showing pearly white teeth between her carefully painted lips. "Congratulations, then." Sasuke murmured something accepting, and Sakura smiled and bowed. The rest of the company gave similar obligatory congratulations as well, and Sakura realized that she suddenly seemed to be a lot less interesting to both Shima and Ashinobu. For the first time, Sakura found herself thankful that Fire Country allowed engagements with parental approval from age 12 and up. She took Sasuke's hand and watched him struggle to keep himself from stiffening before awkwardly closing his hand around hers. Ginzu hooted behind their backs as they were led to and crossed the threshold of their room. But Sakura had a difficult time imagining that he really thought they were going to make use of the bed in any interesting way. Even by Fire Country's civilian standards rather than her old world's, they were a bit too young for that to be encouraged. Sasuke let go of her hand carefully when the door closed behind them, and Sakura had the odd feeling that though he didn't want to hold her hand, he also didn't want to offend her by snatching his own out of hers. "Well, it seems like everything is going our way. With Shima accompanying us back, Sakura said, staying in character while casually confirming their mission status. She couldn't see any reason for this room to be under surveillance, but that didn't mean that it wasn't. Sasuke made a grunting sound and sat down on a very large, grandiose chair seated in front of a round glass table. Sakura sat down on the flower-patterned coverlet spread over the king-size bed to wait for Kakashi to signal them. As silence spread between her and Sasuke, her mind turned inexorably towards the revelation of wand wood with a strong enough magical presence to make her body sing. In her first year of this life, she dragged home branches of vine from every available plant of vine which she'd been able to find. There had never been a hint of reaction from either her or the wood, and in defeat, she'd finally mostly stopped looking and turned to other avenues of power. And now this. Being a witch had been a very large part of Hermione's life for a very long time. She defined herself by that word before any other, and losing that part of herself had been much worse than she imagined losing a limb would have been, like losing sight or hearing. And now, slanting a glance at Sasuke and finding him settled into contemplation of his own, she did what she'd done 100 times before in this life and the previous. She descended into the large library that had always represented her mind. Every book on every sturdy oaken shelf was a memory, and the library itself was maze-like. She stood in the middle of it all and felt out her mind with tendrils of thought, like dipping her hand into deep ocean water. But where before there had been not a hint of magic, now something smoldered from below the stone floors. She could feel it in the ocean of thoughts and memories, warming the waters in a way she hadn't felt in a very long time. There wasn't just chakra here anymore. Reaching down, she put her palms to the library floor and knew she couldn't push through the solid stone to what lay beneath. It was too weak, yet too little, the glow too dim. But there, it was there, Sakura. Sakura involuntarily vaulted back out of her mind at the sound of Sasuke's voice and found him hovering in front of her, a frown on his face. What is it? What? The feeling of success, even though she hadn't actually done anything to kickstart this development, made her flush with energy. I called you and you didn't respond, he said, voice level. Then something uncomfortable came over his face, breaking the severity of his expression. Is something wrong? No, I'm fine. I was just lost in my own head there. She didn't add, thank you for your concern, because she knew that would push him away. She must have looked very tense and wrinkly-browed for him to look at her like he didn't believe her. Nobody's going to get in, Sasuke said after a pause. And even if anyone did, they're just civilians. Neither of us would have any problem taking them down. Sakura blinked, thrown out of her train of thought, where the mission and Ginzu's group hadn't featured, and realized she'd allowed herself to become well and truly distracted. He thought she was worried. Is he trying to comfort me? Sakura wondered and almost smiled. I know. Thank you, she added quietly. Sasuke stretched uncomfortably and turned his gaze away. But he didn't look like he wanted to take off or jump out the window at her small comment. Sakura was just about to attempt to keep the conversation going, if only to stop Sasuke from brooding on whether he was starting to become inappropriately soft for an Avenger or some such, when a wall above the bed exploded. First there was a wall with fancy wallpaper, and then there was a star-shaped crack that in 1/10 of a second blew outwards. Sakura flew off the bed, arming herself as she did and landing beside Sasuke, who was drawing out a series of kunai from behind his high collar. The hole formed like something was slamming through the wall in just that one spot, and it was completely without sound. It was like someone had pressed a mute button, or like she'd read the silence deep space was like. If not for her own and Sasuke's breathing, she would have thought someone had enveloped them in some kind of genjutsu. Sasuke let a kunai rip through the air, and then Sakura took aim with her sunban. But before her weapon could follow Sasuke's trajectory, she heard Naruto's indignant voice. What was that for, bastard? His mop of yellow hair popped into view, and then the rest of his body followed. Kakashi waved at them from behind him, casually holding up his hand in Konoha's all-safe sign. We thought you were an enemy, Sakura said, placating, thinking that if Kakashi was comfortable enough to put a pretty sizable hole in the wall, he must have determined that there was no surveillance here. Or else that it didn't matter if there was. You blew a hole through the wall. If you didn't want us to attack you, you should have warned us first. Sasuke's voice was a study in neutrality, but his grip on the kunai was white-knuckled. Flipping from a battle-ready position to calmness was difficult. Sakura could do it because she was used to it from the war, but her ability to calm quickly after an adrenaline rush like that had become rusty. She whooshed out a breath. Well, at least it hadn't been an enemy shinobi popping up out of nowhere. "We have a problem," said Kakashi, stepping into the room after Naruto. Behind him, the two ANBU had reappeared and moved into the room like shadows. "That woman, Ohisa, is not a civilian. She's an A-ranked Niko-TE specialist from Kumo known by the name Hibana no Hibi, the Sparking Viper." The name was strangely fitting for the glamorous woman with the knife smile. That irrelevant thought floated by as Sakura tried to push down the ominous feeling rising up into her throat. She'd been too optimistic, clearly. She really should have known better. Naruto was crossing and uncrossing his arm, an unusually aggravated frown on his face. "I don't get why we have to capture her if she isn't really doing anything illegal," he said, for what felt like the umpteenth time. Admittedly, Kakashi hadn't really answered the question properly the first time Naruto had posed it. Because a Kumonin traipsing over Fire Country is suspicious, Sasuke answered in place of their teacher, annoyed. "But we don't know if she's doing anything suspicious," Naruto said, glaring at Sasuke. Kakashi, bent over the room's glass table with a paper and pen, was ignoring them both. "I suppose you think an A-ranked kunoichi from foreign country is more likely to just be on vacation here." His voice was snide and contemptuous, and Naruto bit out some insult, and off they were, arguing away in hushed voices. Sakura knew Naruto wasn't stupid. He just hadn't been stripped of his innate belief in the general trustworthiness of strangers, which was fairly odd considering that he hadn't had a lot of friends in the academy. But perhaps it was a coping mechanism, or else just a personality trait. She doubted he'd be able to keep that faith in humanity for much longer now that they'd started their careers as shinobi. Normally, she'd have taken that thought further, perhaps worried for Naruto's sake. But as it was, Sakura's focus remained firmly on how to get a hold of Wand would before they left this place. She'd need to acquire a core of some kind too, of course. But one step in the right direction was one step further than she'd been able to take in all her years in this world. "Enough," said Kakashi finally, before the boys could exchange verbal insults for physical blows. He rolled the piece of paper he'd been writing on into a cylinder that disappeared into a pocket. The Jounin ordered the two ANBU to scout and made a few quick hand signs that Sakura didn't recognize. Must be internal ANBU speak. An A-ranked ninja hovering around a member of Fire Country's ruling family would set off all kinds of alarms in a Jounin's head. It was definitely of enough concern for their original mission to be shoved to the side, at least for the moment. Though officially Konoha and Kumo's relations were amiable if distant, the unofficial but widely known truth was that those relations teetered precariously close to being antagonistic. Konoha and Kumo hadn't clashed often in the last war, and their cordial relations afterward had been of as genuine a nature as relations between two major hidden villages ever could be. But about a decade ago, something had happened. Sakura knew it had involved the Hyuga and a Kumo diplomat, but had not been able to suss out the exact details. Whatever had happened soured the two villages' tentative, burgeoning alliance and slit the throats of all their regular transactions. Kumo had been considered borderline hostile ever since. "What are we going to do?" Sakura wondered out loud in Kakashi's direction. He'd been tense and stiff-browed since he and Naruto climbed into the room. Kakashi sighed. "We only have until tomorrow to resolve this, as per the agreement made with Shima about our journey to Konoha. That means I'll have to trust your academy scores on infiltration to be accurate on that. Sakura, yours was the highest, so I expect the most from you." Sakura nodded when the Jounin looked her way, but didn't see why they couldn't try to stall for time. Kakashi probably had his reasons, though. She wasn't too eager for whatever plan would have need of their infiltration skills, hoping in the back of her mind that it wouldn't have anything to do with Shima or Ashinobu's apparent interest in her. "Do you think she recognized us as shinobi?" Sasuke asked. A very good question, though since Kakashi had just mentioned infiltration, Sakura was leaning toward the answer being no. If Ohisa had recognized them, What would be the point in even attempting any level of infiltration at this point? You three? No. And I doubt she recognized me in this getup. The only reason I recognized her was because she was not in disguise herself. The cold moonlight coming through the window threw glints of bright silver over the dyed, limp strands of Kakashi's hair. That weird, though, isn't it? That she's not disguised. Naruto sat down on the bed, head tilted curiously. He didn't seem particularly worried about the developing situation. Not particularly. She utilizes different disguises every time she appears, so most bingo books don't have an accurate picture or description of her appearance. Naruto frowned. But if we don't have pictures of her, how do you know she's not wearing a disguise now? Kakashi's mouth was a straight, narrow line. Because this isn't the first time she's gotten herself involved with Fire Country nobility. The Jounin explained what he needed them to do. The plan wasn't particularly complicated, but Sakura couldn't help being just a bit nervous anyway. Kakashi had waved the paper he'd been writing on their way after explaining that he was going to cause a distraction. The intention was for that distraction to make everyone in the hotel rush out of their rooms, leaving Sakura and Sasuke free to put on a little show. I don't get why I can't do the same thing you guys are, Naruto muttered, leaning his chin into his palm. I'm not that bad at infiltration. I don't think Kakashi-sensei meant to imply that he didn't believe you could do what we're doing, said Sakura, and hoped she didn't sound insincere. Kakashi definitely thought better of hers and Sasuke's ability to stay in character when needed. And hers and Sasuke's little show only required the two of them at this stage anyway. Plus, sneaking into Ohisa's room isn't a task to sneeze at. She tried to sound encouraging because that part was actually true. It's only cause I said I'd stolen things before, and because I can use Kagebunshin. So it won't even be me sneaking anywhere. Naruto blew out a breath and stared moodily at the hole in the wall. I don't even know what a gold digger would steal. Don't they use up other people's money with their consent? Well, yes, typically. But I think he only used that word to make it easier to understand what kind of woman we're trying to portray Ohisa as. Sakura clasped her hands together, fidgeting enough to feel the comforting outline of the long sunbon strapped to her arm wriggle in its fastenings. Naruto thought on that and then nodded, still frowning. But maybe she doesn't have a purse for me to put the stolen stuff into. It's unlikely that a civilian woman would travel to a hotel without bringing a purse or a bag. It might even be unusual enough for someone to take notice. And that's the last thing you want when you're doing infiltration work. But isn't she trying to be a classy prostitute? We don't know that for sure, said Sakura, though privately she thought it unlikely that Ginzu and Ohisa weren't sleeping together. But the two of them having sex didn't mean Ohisa was going for a working girl portrayal. Make the clone, Sasuke said suddenly, and as always, he made it sound like an order. Naruto glared at him, crossed his arms and huffed, muttering about how he was going to wait until he heard the sound of Kakashi's distraction. As if conjured by his words, there was the sudden sound of something very big exploding somewhere on the other side of the building. The whoosh-bang of a house being thoroughly obliterated, Sakura thought. Naruto quickly created the clone that was to sneak into Ginzu's room, pushing as much chakra into it as he could without overloading the technique, as Kakashi has told them all that would enable it to last longer. The clone transformed, giving itself a dull, unremarkable appearance, and moved out the window. Sakura ruffled her hair to make herself look more like she'd just woken up, and despite Sasuke's glare, did the same to him. Naruto grinned and copied her, making his own already messy hair even messier. Shouldn't we cover up the hole in the wall? Sasuke muttered as they moved out of the room, and Sakura shrugged. If he'd wanted it covered up, Kakashi would have said something. Naruto had jumped back into the room beside theirs to come out of his own room, just in case, and they met up again in the corridor outside. People milled about, shouting questions and staring out the windows, gawking at the flames reaching for the sky only 100 meters or so outside. Everyone congregated in the anteroom, where the Hankyu's employees were attempting to diffuse the brewing panic among their guests. Sasuke tapped the back of his knuckles discreetly on her shoulder and tilted his head towards the group of people in a corner, taking up more room than they needed. Ginzu's entourage was difficult to miss, if only because their night clothes were the most elaborate in sight. And so the show begins. Sakura adopted a worried expression and reached for Sasuke. Sakura-chan. Ginzu greeted when she and Sasuke, hand in hand, approached the group. Naruto trailed after them, eyes wide as he looked at the enormous amount of people milling about the hall. And Kintsuku-kun, what a terrifying way to be woken up, huh? Yes, awful, Sakura agreed, and they spent a few minutes wondering aloud what could possibly be happening. It wasn't as difficult as she'd feared to put on the scared little girl act, or even to keep their focus on her, as she did. Perhaps we should consider leaving the resort? Ohisa piped up, voice sleep-roughened, or roughened by other activities. Ginza hummed, obviously considering his companion's words. Well, crap, Sakura thought. They couldn't be allowed to leave just yet. Sasuke spoke up, and Sakura was glad she was the only one who could feel the telling tension in his muscles. I don't want to go out there before the police arrive to steer up the crowds. We be trampled. The panic is worse out there than in here. Here he gave her an artificially concerned look. Sakura was impressed. Maybe her teammate worked better under pressure, because she'd never thought that the grumpy, everyday Sasuke would be able to turn on an expression like that. It didn't look completely genuine, but that she could only tell because she was meeting his eyes and the concerned warmth there was lacking. I'm not sure it's any safer out there. What if there's fighting? Or what if more things explode? Sakura put her head on his shoulder and nodded into his neck. Sasuke tensed even more, and a second later, she felt the muscles of his throat forcibly relax against her forehead. I agree with Kintsuku. It's warmer in here, and there's food. I don't think it could hurt to wait a little longer before going out. Maybe things will have cleared up some by then. You have a point, said Ginzu, and Sakura might have imagined it because her attention was focused more on Ohisa than on Ginzu, but she thought she saw something flutter in the kunoichi's gaze. We'll stay in here, said Naruto, patting her arm in a comforting way, and also tapping the all-clear signal more discreetly than she'd believed him capable of. So his clone had dispelled. Sakura tapped the message into Sasuke's palm. Where's your uncle? Children, asked Ohisa, the corners of her mouth turning up a little as she spoke. It looked less like a smile and more like a threat, but that was the way of all Ohisa's expressions, really. It was fortunate for her that she wasn't trying to portray a kinder woman, because she had edges too sharp to ever be seen as kindly, or at least as the person she was currently posing as did. You want to find out what's happening, Sakura said, making sure to sound miserable and worried. The boys came together around her, patting her back and murmuring comforting words. It felt quite nice. It was too bad that it was all just for show. It did have the added benefit of making Ginzu look down at them warmly. I'm sure your uncle is just fine. But Kakashi didn't return for half an hour, and the concern Sakura was pretending to feel was starting to become real. It didn't help that Ginzu and Ashinobu kept fussing over her, and Sasuke either. She had a feeling her Uchiha teammate had reached the point where he was entertaining himself with homicidal fantasies just to keep from snapping at them, and Naruto had been tapping his foot against the ground rhythmically for the past 10 minutes. Sakura doubted it was to stay in character, but since the impatient movements wouldn't cause suspicion, and she knew he found it difficult to stay quiet and in the background even with Kakashi's orders to do so, she said nothing. An employee had placed a tray with steaming tea on their table before rushing by with an apology for the current chaos in the hall. Just as Sakura was about to discreetly suggest that Naruto send out a few clones to look for Kakashi, their teacher appeared. I apologize for the wait, he said, smiling that awkward smile. The stench of smoke clung to him like invisible mist. Try to find someone who knew anything about the goings-on outside was more difficult than I expected, and navigating the throng of people wasn't too easy either. Ginzu waved off the apology. No matter. What did you find out? It seems a few teenagers were playing with fire in the distillery across the street, of all places. He rolled his eyes a little, shrugging his shoulders in a non-verbal comment about the stupidity of children. Sakura had to admire the way his easy body language and casual tone relaxed the atmosphere. It wasn't too long after Kakashi's return that the Hankyu employees began steering people back into their rooms with explanations and apologies about the disturbance. The number of employees rushing around seemed to have doubled, and they were all still smiling in that professional serial killer shiny way. I guess this means we'll get a few more hours of sleep, said Ginzu and smiled at his group. There were murmurs of agreement, as there always was when the daimyo's son said anything, and they began to move en masse. Team 7 separated and moved into their respective rooms, but a second later Kakashi and Naruto were climbing through the hole to join Sakura and Sasuke in theirs. What really happened, Kakashi? Demanded Sasuke, crossing his arms over his chest and turning towards their teacher. Kakashi gave him a slow glance. I ran into some unexpected opposition. Without further explanation, he took off his eye patch to reveal a Sharingan. Even Sakura, who had little experience with dojutsu eyes, recognized as infected. Naruto rushed forward and would probably have put his fingers close to the eye if Kakashi hadn't batted him away. What happened? Ohisa isn't the only Kumo shinobi in the neighborhood. Kakashi sat down on the bed and leaned his chin on the knuckles of his right hand. For having an eye that looked like someone had poured a cup of lemon juice into it, he seemed remarkably unbothered. I encounter man, blonde, mid-20s, Jinjutsu-oriented, Hittite around his forehead. We fought. He used some kind of blinding technique and escaped. Sakura frowned. Are you injured anywhere else besides your eye? It wasn't like she was going to be of much use even if he was injured, but it couldn't hurt to ask. And should we be standing guard? Or move out? Shallow stab wound. Already taken care of. He eye-smiled in that infuriating way of his, before adding, and I don't think that particular Kumo shinobi will get very far, regardless. He pulled out a small sealing scroll and waved it in the direction of the floor. The scroll promptly spit out a dismembered arm, the long fingers and bruised, bony knuckles twitching against the carpet as it rolled. Sasuke made a disgusted sound when it stopped at his feet. In the same moment, Naruto gave a strangled yelp and jumped back, hands flailing. Was that really necessary? Sakura asked, frowning down at it and feeling strangely nostalgic. There'd been a spell once that could take off an opponent's limbs in such a way that it was still magically linked to the body for easy reattachment. Very useful for capturing prisoners unharmed. The arm was very neatly severed and bloodless, the flesh a pinkish white where it would have been attached to the shoulder. What kind of technique does that? Sakura wondered. Do you think there are more Kumo shinobi in the area? Sasuke asked, stepping around the arm to lean against the wall opposite Kakashi. Sakura looked up briefly at that and caught the Jounin watching her for a moment before he turned to answer the question. I sent out 2 clones to ensure that if that is the case, they won't be able to make contact with Ohisa, unless they have some other way of contacting her. One that doesn't require a physical meeting, said Sakura, looking up from where her gaze had caught on the dead limb again to stare at their teacher. And if they don't have a set contact time every day, where an absence would be noted immediately. Kakashi rolled his shoulders and gave her a ridiculous pout. Ma, so pessimistic. Realistic, you mean, said Sasuke. Their teacher smiled, both eyes crinkling. I've taken care of it. Don't worry your cute little heads. You'll get premature wrinkles. Sasuke huffed irritably. Naruto muttered something insulting under his breath, and Sakura sighed. It was good to have the Jounin back, but she really could do without the exasperating commentary. Get some sleep, brats. We have work to do in the morning. Kakashi picked up the arm and wandered back into the other room. Sasuke sat down on the floor and leaned his head back on the wall with a frown. Naruto jumped into bed, literally, and bounced a few times before settling under the covers. Sakura made herself comfortable beside him by the headboard, closed her eyes, and descended once more to feel the magic beneath the ground in her mindscape. The morning dawned with loud shouting coming from Ginzu's room, and both Sakura and Sasuke were on their feet and looking out the door a moment later. Where is it? Where? You're the only person to have been in this room besides me. It was more screeching than angry growling, but Sakura thought it suited Ginzu's personality. She could just imagine him stamping his foot and believing that it looked imposing. Sakura turned towards the bed, where her other teammate was rubbing his blonde hair and yawning. Naruto, what exactly did you steal from Ginzu? You mean, what did Ohisa steal from him? I got this really nice watch he had in his pocket. You know, one of those traditional ones with zodiac signs. You mean a Wadoki-eye? Said Sasuke, raising a brow. He had a Wadoki-eye in his pocket. By the incredulous tone, Sakura assumed Wadoki-eye generally weren't kept in pockets. Too big, maybe, or too expensive? I'm not lying, said Naruto. It was really old-looking, with a golden backside and a strap made of some scaly leather. It smelled really funny too, like flowers. Sounds like it's made with rose-tanned crocodile leather. Both exclusive and expensive. Sasuke nodded a little, and then apparently noticed that both Sakura and Naruto were staring at him. If she hadn't been standing so close to him, she'd never have noticed the tips of his ears turning pink at their attention. What? He said irritably. I once had a cousin who was into sculpting and pottery and mechanical arts. Apparently realizing that he'd just revealed something personal on impulse, Sasuke blinked and quickly turned away. Sakura and Naruto glanced at each other before putting their focus back on the corridor. Kakashi waved them forward a second later. Sasuke walked out ahead of her, and Naruto with his shoulders stiffly drawn back. She hoped it wouldn't seem suspicious to Ginzu's people that they weren't walking together, because she didn't really want to force his hand into hers right now. You think I would need to steal from you? Ohisa's voice was high and offended, and her slim neck strained as she tilted her chin up in challenge. Ginzu was flushed with anger, which seemed to make his companions quite nervous. Need? No, I think you saw the maker's name on the back and decided you wanted it. Who was the maker? Sakura whispered to Naruto, hoping he remembered. Tanaka Hisashige, said Naruto very quietly, but shrugged to show that he didn't know the name. Sakura didn't recognize it either, but she would bet that Sasuke would have. Let's calm down, shall we? Kakashi tried in his disguise's awkward-sounding voice while making ineffective calming hand gestures. What has happened? Has something been stolen? Ginzu spun to face him. Yes, this woman has stolen an antique wristwatch from me. It's been in my family for generations, and now she's probably planning to pawn it to earn a quick coin. That was one hell of a leap to make, in Sakura's opinion. But then, Ginzu hadn't struck her as the kind of person who would stand back and try to observe a situation critically, or logically, or quietly. I demand we call the police. Or better yet, my father's court. Who the hell takes a petty theft to the daimyo's court? Thought Sakura, and tried not to let her less-than-impressed thoughts show on her face. All right, so maybe it's not petty theft, but grand larceny, considering how expensive and old the clock apparently is, but still. Ginzu was being ridiculously entitled rich boy dramatic. At least calling the police, if premature, wasn't an unreasonable response. But, we're on our way to Konoha, and there's a council. Kakashi tried, and Sakura saw just how he planned to play it. Konoha's village council dealt with nobility problems quite often, as she'd understood it. And if Ohisa accompanied them there, they'd have a kimonin in custody without having to fight for it. Over the din of Ginzu's accusations and Ohisa's indignant protestations, apparently only Ashibu heard what Kakashi attempted to say to stave off the fight. He cleared his throat and began, I believe Konohagakure's council could be of assistance in this case. They are an objective power, and the court has utilized their services before. If the man honestly believed that Konoha's village council was in any way objective, he was an idiot. The daimyo's court held a lot of sway in the country, and any issue could be made political if someone felt it would be useful to their agenda. That thought was in the back of Sakura's mind, even as she gave Kakashi, who was so conveniently placed next to Ashibu when he'd said what he did, a dry look. Nobody would suspect that he'd put the idea of Ohisa and Ginzu accompanying them to Konoha into Ashinobu's head. And now, depending on Ohisa's response, they'd know just what kind of game she was running. Sakura had dealt with infiltrators before, of course, and not just during her Hogwarts years. Kingsley Shacklebolt had been made minister after the Battle of Hogwarts, true, but he hadn't been seated solidly in his position from the start. During those days, it had seemed like Death Eaters were potentially hiding behind every stranger's smile. Fine, said Ohisa, voice trembling with outrage. Take me to Konohagakure. I have done nothing wrong. So it's a long game then, Sakura thought. If the Kunoichi was so sure of her cover that she was willing to walk straight into Konoha, she must be very deep undercover. Said Kakashi, a masterful expression of helpless confusion on his face. So I guess we have more company on our way to Konoha, he said, half-turned toward Shima. It would seem so, said Shima, and didn't look particularly happy about the prospect. Perhaps we should have one of their shinobi meet us halfway, he said to Ginzu, who nodded fiercely and then glared at Ohisa. Ashinobu made an imperious gesture towards one harried-looking Hankyu employee. I'll send a bird, he said. Traveling at a civilian's pace was far more boring than Sakura remembered it being as Hermione. Maybe because back then she'd had no other choice other than flying, and she'd never been very fond of great heights. Her left hand had remained in her pocket ever since they left the Hankyu, fingertips ghosting over the handful of thin branches therein. They vibrated faintly at her touch, and every time they responded like she'd spent years hoping a wood would respond to her, she had to fight down a smile. Kakashi and Shima were speaking quietly up ahead, with Sasuke listening in and Naruto thoroughly distracted by the still ongoing, if now silent, drama between Ohisa and Ginzu. The man had left most of his retinue behind, excepting 2 servants and some kind of retainer or bodyguard, and was obviously unused to walking for long periods of time. Perhaps we should have brought a palanquin for him to be carried around in, Sakura thought uncharitably. At least the nobleman wasn't complaining about having to walk. Yet. Though perhaps that was only due to his and Ohisa's silent battle of wills staring contest distracting him. They continued in silence for what felt like only a little while longer to Sakura, lost in thought as she was, until a low female voice called out for them to halt, and she realized the trees surrounding them had gone from being mostly spruce to mostly beech. I am Mitarashi Anko, Tokubetsu Jounin of Kanahagakure no Sato, and I am searching for Ginzadano of the Fire Daimyo's court. Have I found him? She asked, coming closer and looking like she was actually wondering just that. But there was no way she would have announced herself like that if she hadn't been sure. Maybe it was just politeness to ask. Somewhat pompous politeness. Though it could be that that's what someone of Ginzu's station required. You have found me, Kunoichi-san. Ginza didn't sound nearly as casual as he had when speaking to everyone else at the Hankyu, and the tint of nervousness coloring his voice made Sakura wonder about the reputation of shinobi in the world at large. The opinions of the civilians living in Konoha didn't necessarily mirror the opinions of civilians living outside the hidden villages, those who didn't run into shinobi on a day-to-day basis. What did those unused to shinobi think of them? Were they seen as weapons to be wielded or as barely caged tigers? As soldiers, perhaps? Kakashi pulled an anxious expression over his visible features, and Sakura wondered if he'd be recognized, or maybe if he'd sent a message ahead to whoever was coming. His current disguise might be enough to fool an acquaintance, but if he'd worked with this Mitarashi before, there was little chance she wouldn't recognize him. Sakura decided to let her teacher handle that potential worry and attempted to copy his uneasy look at the sight of the approaching shinobi. "Understand there has been a theft," said the woman when she was close enough that she didn't have to raise her voice. Her pale brown eyes glanced over them all, never lingering on any one person. Sakura tried not to stare at her mesh bodysuit, which, although clearly made of a material that closely matched her skin in between the actual latticework, was still tight enough for her to appear to be naked underneath. Indeed, this woman, and here Ginzu unnecessarily pointed at Ohisa, who was standing only 3 meters to his right, has stolen a very important heirloom from me. I wish for her to be tried by Kanahagakure's village council. Mitarashi turned her head to look Ohisa up and down. The kimonin pursed her lips and then straightened her back. I haven't stolen anything from him, and I don't mind being tried by your council. The Konoha Kunoichi smiled. It was not a nice smile. Well then, looks like we're all in agreement about what comes next. How fortunate. She turned to dig in one of the large pockets in her overcoat until she found what she was looking for. 2 large wooden rings. Sakura could see chakra moving through active seals and what appeared to be some kind of bracelets, and wondered if Ohisa would let herself be handcuffed with them. Apparently so. Although she frowned down at the rings circling her wrists, the Kunoichi made no attempt to stop Mitarashi from securing them there. It's a shame I couldn't handcuff you under more pleasant circumstances, pretty woman, she murmured to Ohisa, and Sakura tried not to stare at either of them. Was that really protocol? No. Stupid thought, of course it wasn't. Was she trying to unnerve Ohisa? Seduce her? What? Ohisa blinked quickly, didn't blush or look down, and then smiled a little. Sakura wondered if she thought she had an in there. Maybe she did. For all Sakura knew, Mitarashi could be weak for a pretty face. Though the shinobi forces were portrayed as consummate professionals in the academy, they were only human and therefore prone to human deficiencies. "I'll take you both with me," said Mitarashi, nodding towards Ginzu. "The journey to Konoha will be much faster if we travel my way." Ginzu approached with visible hesitance, and as soon as he was within her reach, the kunoichi shined them all away. Sakura wondered if she was fast enough that she could move them all to Konoha in one go, or if she was going to have to shunshin and jumps every few hundred meters. "Well, that was eventful," said Kakashi after a few long seconds of silence. They were all staring at the spot where the kunoichi had disappeared with varying degrees of interest. Ginzu's servants looked horrified. His retainer, perhaps having dealt with abrupt shinobi departures before, just seemed irritated. They slowly began moving again, with Shima taking command of Ginzu's servants like they were expected to obey him now that their master had gone. Perhaps they were. Sakura knew little of how hierarchy worked within the noble ranks in instances like this. As the servants fluttered around Shima, Kakashi drifted back a little until he was by Naruto, bending down to murmur a question in his ear. Sakura couldn't make it out, but Naruto's whispered reply was just loud enough for her to catch. "I put in the little pouch thing she had inside the kimono she was wearing." Nodding, Kakashi casually drifted back to speak with Shima. Naruto stared at him for a moment, perhaps expecting more from their teacher, before shrugging and going to bicker with Sasuke. Despite being in the middle of a mission, the air about their group was relaxed and easy. Sakura allowed herself to daydream, her hand against her new collection of branches, and was thus nearly skewered by the rain of sunbon that suddenly came flying in her direction. The ANBU with the purple hair was suddenly there, yanking her out of the way with a grip strong enough that Sakura briefly thought her arm might break. Naruto shouted something. Sasuke jumped back with a kunai in hand, and Sakura looked over at Kakashi to find him holding an apparently unconscious Shima under his arm while the servants cowered behind him. Mist rolled in over the road and the trees lining it. Very odd, since there were no bodies of water here. Sakura pulled out her long senbon and frowned. She recalled reading about a jutsu that would cause mist thick enough for a shinobi to hide in, and with her frown deepening, Sakura looked about the trees. It was becoming difficult to see the individual branches, the mist seeping into every nook and cranny and blurring all contours. "I was wondering if you were really as defenseless as you looked," said a deep male voice echoing at them from every direction. She'd heard about that jutsu too, though it was a lot less frightening in text than in reality. Before the ground between her and her teammates disappeared completely from view, Sakura darted through the encroaching mist to stand by Sasuke. Naruto made a handful of clones, all of which spread out with their heads swiveling back and forth to try to catch sight of the speaker. The original Naruto pulled in close to her, and Sasuke, arming himself as he did so. "But some no-name shinobi could never hope to defeat me." There was a deep laugh before the voice continued. "So how about you hand over the lordling? You needn't bleed and die for someone of so little importance." I'm afraid we can't do that. Once we accept a mission, we see it through." Kakashi slouched and looked as lazy as ever, but his voice was firm. A man appeared through a shiver in the mist over the road ahead, walking towards them through the haze. He was shirtless with most of his face bandaged, leaving only his eyes visible. Striped gray trousers were held up by the strangest suspenders Sakura had ever seen. Cowskin pattern arm and legwarmers completed the strange getup. If not for the dangerous feel the man gave off, Sakura would probably have laughed at him. "Momochi Zabuza," Kakashi muttered, and suddenly laughing was the farthest thing from Sakura's mind. She'd heard of that name. Momochi Zabuza was a missing nin from Mist, one of the really dangerous ones. Shit, Sakura thought, drawing a kunai with her unoccupied hand as discreetly as she could. My, how nice to be recognized. And I always thought it fitting to know the name of the shinobi whose hands you'll die at. Despite the bandages, Sakura could see him smile. "That's it for today. I will stop here." I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you please consider subscribe and make sure to hit that like button, share with your friends, and don't forget to check out author of this story. Details and description.